Welcome, fellow traveler of infinite realities, to the complete chronicle of Rick Sanchez and the multiverse that both created and destroyed him. Tonight, we journey through every dimension of loss, love, and the desperate search for meaning across endless possibilities. There's no need to follow every twist through space and time. Simply let this story of genius and tragedy carry you through the cosmic expanse like portal fluid through reality itself, guiding you toward peaceful rest as we explore how one man's brilliance became the multiverse's greatest curse and most unlikely salvation. The man who would eventually be known across infinite dimensions as the most dangerous Rick in existence began his story in the most ordinary way imaginable, as a loving father who believed that science could make the world a better place for his daughter. In the quiet suburban dimension designated C-137, before portal guns existed even in theoretical form, before the central finite curve became his gilded prison, Rick Sanchez was simply a brilliant inventor whose greatest creation was not any technological marvel, but the warm domestic life he had built with his wife Diane and their young daughter Beth. His childhood had been unremarkable by most standards. The kind of middle-class American upbringing that produced engineers and doctors rather than interdimensional gods. Rick's parents recognized their son's exceptional intelligence, but lacked the framework to nurture genius properly, worrying privately about his tendency toward obsessive focus and his apparent difficulty connecting with children his own age. Even as a boy, Rick seemed more comfortable with the logical relationships between mechanical components than with the unpredictable emotions of human friendship, a pattern that would define much of his early development and contribute to the isolation that would later make his family losses so absolutely devastating. School provided structure for Rick's voracious intellectual appetite, but it also revealed the vast gulf between his capabilities and those of his peers. He absorbed mathematical concepts with intuitive understanding that amazed his teachers, grasped scientific principles that left classmates struggling, and demonstrated natural facility for engineering that suggested unlimited potential in any technical field he chose to pursue. But this intellectual superiority came at the cost of social connection, creating barriers between Rick and normal human relationships that would never fully disappear, despite his best efforts to bridge them through achievement and contribution. The loneliness of exceptional intelligence drove Rick deeper into his studies and experiments, creating feedback loops that accelerated his development while further isolating him from conventional social structures. He spent countless hours in makeshift laboratories constructed in basements and garages, pursuing projects that ranged from simple electronic devices to increasingly sophisticated attempts at understanding the fundamental nature of reality itself. These early experiments lacked the exotic materials and advanced knowledge that would later enable him to crack the secrets of interdimensional travel, but they established the methodical approach and fearless curiosity that would characterize his entire scientific career, for better and worse. By the time Rick reached adulthood, his reputation as a brilliant scientist had begun to spread beyond his immediate community. He published papers in respected journals, earned advanced degrees from prestigious universities, and attracted attention from government agencies and private corporations eager to recruit exceptional talent for classified research projects. But Rick found himself increasingly uninterested in working within established institutions, preferring the freedom that came with independent research conducted according to his own priorities and timeline rather than bureaucratic demands and profit margins. The garage that would later become legendary as the birthplace of portal technology started as simply a workspace where Rick could pursue investigations without interference from supervisors who might not understand the significance of work that pushed beyond the boundaries of conventional scientific wisdom. the clutter of half-finished inventions, theoretical calculations scrawled on every available surface, and jury-rigged equipment that somehow produced results exceeding professionally designed instruments became the external manifestation of Rick's internal creative process, chaotic to outside observers, but perfectly logical. To the mind that had organized every element according to principles that transcended normal laboratory protocols. During these productive years of independent research, Rick's personal life achieved a delicate balance between his scientific obsessions and his deepening relationship with Diane, a woman whose intelligence and patience proved capable of penetrating the barriers that intellectual giftedness had erected around his emotional availability. Diane understood instinctively that Rick's dedication to his work represented not rejection of human connection, but rather his particular way of trying to understand and improve the world for those he cared about most. Her acceptance of his eccentricities and genuine interest in his discoveries provided Rick with emotional stability he needed to pursue increasingly ambitious theoretical frameworks. Their courtship unfolded against the backdrop of Rick's growing scientific reputation and his development of theories that would eventually lead to his breakthrough in portal physics. Diane proved to be more than just a supportive partner. She became Rick's first and most trusted intellectual collaborator, offering insights that helped him see problems from new perspectives, while providing the human grounding that prevented his research from becoming purely abstract theoretical exercise. Her presence in his life during this crucial developmental period would later make her loss even more psychologically devastating when tragedy finally struck their small family unit. The decision to marry represented a major shift in Rick's priorities, requiring him to acknowledge that human relationships could be as rewarding and intellectually stimulating as scientific discoveries. The wedding ceremony was small and intimate, reflecting both Rick and Diane's preference for meaningful connection over social spectacle, but the commitment they made to each other established the foundation for a partnership that would produce not only personal happiness, but also some of Rick's most creative and significant theoretical work during the period when he still believed that science should serve humanity rather than transcend it. The birth of Beth marked another profound transformation in Rick's understanding of what truly mattered in existence. Holding his daughter for the first time, seeing her tiny fingers wrap around his thumb with unconscious trust, Rick experienced emotions that his scientific training had not prepared him to analyze or categorize effectively. The fierce, protective love that flooded through him was simultaneously irrational and absolutely compelling, adding new dimensions to his existence that made every equation more meaningful because it contributed to the world he was helping create for her future development and happiness. Fatherhood brought out aspects of Rick's personality that had remained dormant during his years of focused academic achievement and professional recognition. He proved surprisingly patient with Beth's endless questions about how things worked, taking genuine pleasure in explaining scientific concepts in terms that a bright child could understand and appreciate. The garage became a place where father and daughter could collaborate on simple projects, building birdhouses that demonstrated basic engineering principles, constructing elaborate marble runs that illustrated physics concepts, creating educational toys that made learning feel like play rather than obligation. The family routines that developed around Rick's work schedule represented carefully negotiated balance between his research pursuits and domestic responsibilities that he had never expected to find so fulfilling. Mornings were reserved for family time, breakfast conversations with Diane and Beth, discussions about plans and dreams, small rituals that bound them together as a unit. Afternoons belonged to scientific investigation, with Rick disappearing into his garage laboratory while Diane managed household affairs and Beth attended school or played with neighborhood children who admired her unusual toys and her father's reputation as the local genius. Evenings brought the family back together for dinner, conversations, homework assistance, and quiet companionship that marked healthy family relationships built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Rick discovered that explaining his work to Diane helped clarify his own thinking, while Beth's innocent questions often revealed assumptions he had not examined carefully enough. The domestic life he had initially viewed as potential distraction from important work became instead a source of inspiration and motivation that gave deeper meaning to every theoretical breakthrough and experimental success. Rick's scientific work, during this period of domestic stability, continued advancing along trajectories that would eventually converge on the theoretical frameworks necessary for interdimensional travel, but the research maintained a grounded quality that reflected his connection to family and community rather than pure intellectual curiosity. His notebooks from this time reveal a mind grappling with increasingly complex mathematical relationships, while never losing sight of the practical applications that might benefit ordinary people trying to build better lives for themselves and their children. The theories Rick developed built systematically toward insights that would later enable portal technology, but they were motivated by humanitarian goals, rather than the desire for godlike power that would consume him after tragedy struck. His work on quantum mechanics revealed mathematical relationships suggesting multiple parallel universes, but he approached these discoveries with wonder rather than the calculating opportunism that would later characterize his multiversal activities. His investigations into energy manipulation uncovered principles that would eventually allow interdimensional travel, but he pursued them with hopes of solving energy crises rather than escaping the limitations of single reality existence. Perhaps most importantly, Rick's research during this happy period was characterized by ethical considerations and collaborative instincts that would later be completely abandoned in his quest for revenge against Rick Prime. His notebook entries frequently referenced hopes that scientific advancement could reduce suffering, improve living conditions for families like his own, and create a better world for Beth to inherit as she grew into her own remarkable potential. The idealism that motivated his work was genuine and deeply felt, reflecting Diane's influence and Beth's innocent trust in her father's ability to make wonderful things happen through careful observation and creative problem-solving. The garage workshop where Rick conducted his experiments became a source of fascination for young Beth, who would often watch her father work while asking penetrating questions that only children possess the courage to formulate without self-consciousness. She wanted to understand not just what he was doing, but why it mattered, how his inventions might help people, and whether she could learn to build similar devices when she grew older and develop the necessary skills and knowledge. Rick's patient explanations to his daughter helped organize his own thinking while reinforcing his sense of connection to the broader human community that his work was intended to serve. Diane's contributions to Rick's research extended beyond emotional support to include practical assistance and intellectual collaboration that enriched his purely scientific approach with broader philosophical perspectives. Her background in literature and philosophy provided frameworks for considering the implications of his discoveries and their potential impact on society and human relationships. Their late-night conversations about consciousness, reality, and the responsibilities that accompanied advanced knowledge helped shape Rick's understanding of himself as both scientist and family man, roles that seemed perfectly compatible during this golden period of his development. The neighborhood where Rick's family lived was typical of middle-class communities in mid-20th century America. Tree-lined streets, modest houses with well-maintained yards, children playing safely while parents pursued ordinary concerns about education and financial security. Rick's reputation as the local genius was well established but approachable rather than intimidating, and neighbors would occasionally ask him to help with minor technical problems that his expertise could easily resolve. He was always willing to contribute his knowledge to community projects that might benefit everyone, viewing such service as natural extension of his research goals. The normalcy of Rick's domestic life during this period would later seem almost impossible when compared to the chaos and violence that characterized his existence after losing his original family. But photographic evidence preserved memories of genuine happiness. Rick smiling while pushing Beth on a swing, teaching her to ride a bicycle, sitting on the front porch with Diane, while watching their daughter play in the yard with other children, who accepted her unusual intelligence as simply another interesting aspect of their neighborhood community. Rick's relationship with Beth established patterns of interaction that would later influence his desperate need to find replacement family connections after tragedy destroyed his original sources of meaning and purpose. He was a devoted father who celebrated every milestone in his daughter's development, from first words to first successful engineering projects, completed in his workshop under careful supervision. The pride he felt in her intelligence and creativity was matched only by his determination to protect her from any harm or disappointment that the world might attempt to inflict on someone so precious and vulnerable. The scientific breakthroughs Rick achieved during this period of family stability provided crucial groundwork for portal technology, but they were pursued with wonder rather than the grim determination that would later consume him. His theoretical work on parallel dimensions satisfied intellectual curiosity without raising questions about practical applications that might disrupt the beautiful life he had built with Diane and Beth in their particular version of reality. The mathematical elegance of multiple universes provided aesthetic pleasure without suggesting that their current existence was somehow inadequate or limiting. But even during these peaceful years, Rick's notebooks reveal underlying restlessness and dissatisfaction with conventional scientific methods that would eventually drive him toward the dangerous experiments that followed his family's murder. He was beginning to push against boundaries of what seemed possible with existing knowledge and equipment, formulating questions that would require entirely new approaches to answer satisfactorily. The seeds of his future obsession with transcending normal human limitations were present but dormant, suppressed by family responsibilities that provided more than sufficient motivation for remaining grounded in single reality existence. The balance between Rick's scientific ambitions and family responsibilities would soon face its ultimate test with the arrival of a visitor who would offer him everything he thought he wanted, while destroying everything he actually needed. But for now, in these final precious months before his world ended forever, Rick Sanchez remained exactly what the universe needed: a brilliant man who used his gifts in service of love rather than power, who chose humility over godhood, and who found infinite meaning in the beautiful limitations of one perfect family in one irreplaceable dimension of reality. The morning that would destroy everything Rick Sanchez had ever loved began like any other in the peaceful suburban dimension designated C-137, with sunlight streaming through kitchen windows while Diane prepared breakfast and young Beth practiced writing letters at the dining room table. Rick emerged from his garage workshop carrying the scent of metal and electricity on his clothes, his hair disheveled from another late night spent pursuing theoretical frameworks that danced tantalizingly just beyond his current understanding. The normalcy of the scene, coffee brewing, newspaper folded beside his plate, his daughter's tongue protruding slightly as she concentrated on forming perfect cursive letters, would later seem like a cruel joke played by a universe that specialized in destroying beauty without warning or justification. Rick had been making remarkable progress on his dimensional physics calculations, working through mathematical relationships that suggested the existence of infinite parallel realities existing simultaneously in quantum superposition. The equations were elegant and compelling, pointing toward possibilities that exceeded anything conventional science had dared to imagine, but Rick approached them with the careful methodology that had characterized all his research, theoretical investigation, designed to expand human understanding, rather than practical application that might disrupt the perfect life he had built with his family. The idea that such knowledge might be weaponized or used to escape the beautiful limitations of single reality existence had not yet occurred to him. The knock at the front door came precisely at 10:37 in the morning, a detail that would later be burned into Rick's memory with crystalline clarity despite the psychological chaos that followed. Diane answered while Rick helped Beth sound out a particularly challenging word, their domestic routine continuing peacefully until his wife's voice carried an odd note of confusion that made him look up from his daughter's homework. Standing in their doorway was a man who looked exactly like Rick himself, but carrying himself with casual confidence that suggested experiences and knowledge far beyond anything Rick had accumulated during his years of careful research and family responsibility. Rick Prime's appearance was simultaneously familiar and alien, identical facial features and body structure, but accompanied by subtle differences in posture and expression that marked him as fundamentally different from the man whose life he was about to destroy forever. His clothes were similar but somehow more sophisticated, his hair styled with careless precision that suggested advanced technology rather than simple vanity, and his eyes held depths of knowledge and cynicism that Rick had not yet developed through his own comparatively innocent scientific pursuits. Most unsettling was the smile that played across Rick Prime's lips, casual amusement that suggested he viewed Rick's entire existence as mildly entertaining rather than meaningful or significant. The conversation that followed would replay in Rick's mind countless times over the decades that came after. Every word and gesture analyzed obsessively for clues about what might have been different if he had made other choices during those crucial minutes. Rick Prime introduced himself as a version of Rick from another dimension, a casual revelation that should have been earth-shattering but was delivered with the same tone someone might use to comment on the weather. He explained portal technology with condescending brevity, describing interdimensional travel as if it were no more significant than learning to drive a car, while Rick struggled to process implications that challenged everything he thought he understood about the nature of reality itself. The offer Rick Prime made was presented as generous gift rather than the poisoned chalice it would prove to be: complete theoretical frameworks for portal gun construction, access to infinite realities where every possibility existed simultaneously, freedom from the limitations that confined ordinary humans to single dimensions with single outcomes for every decision. Rick Prime spoke of infinite versions of themselves, living infinite variations of every possible life, suggesting that attachment to any particular reality was naive sentimentality that prevented truly intelligent beings from achieving their full potential. The condescension in his voice made clear that he viewed Rick's commitment to family and single-dimensional existence as weakness rather than strength. Rick's refusal was immediate and instinctive, based not on careful analysis of potential consequences, but on visceral recognition that what Rick Prime offered would require abandoning everything that made existence meaningful and worthwhile. The life he had built with Diane and Beth was not a limitation to be transcended, but rather the source of all value and purpose that gave significance to his scientific work and personal development. The idea of treating infinite realities as interchangeable resources to be exploited rather than unique treasures to be cherished violated every ethical principle that guided Rick's research and family relationships. But Rick Prime's reaction to this rejection revealed the true nature of the choice Rick was being offered: cooperation or destruction, with no middle ground available for those who preferred different approaches to power and responsibility. The casual cruelty with which Rick Prime responded to Rick's moral reasoning demonstrated how completely the interdimensional life had severed his connection to normal human values and emotional responses. Rick Prime had not come to offer partnership, but to eliminate potential competition from a version of himself who might develop similar capabilities while retaining ethical constraints that Rick Prime had long since abandoned. The bomb that Rick Prime produced was a masterpiece of miniaturized destruction, elegant in its efficiency and terrifying in its implications for the level of technological advancement that Rick Prime had achieved during his multiversal travels. The device was small enough to fit in his palm, but sophisticated enough to incorporate energy manipulation principles that Rick's theoretical frameworks had only begun to explore in abstract mathematical terms. The casual way Rick Prime handled the weapon revealed how routine such violence had become for someone who viewed individual lives and relationships as expendable resources rather than irreplaceable treasures, deserving protection and respect. Rick Prime's explanation of the bomb's purpose was delivered with the same condescending tone he had used to describe portal technology, as if mass murder was simply another tool for achieving desired outcomes rather than the ultimate violation of everything that made existence valuable. He wanted Rick to understand that refusal carried consequences not just for himself but for everyone he loved, that choosing family over power meant condemning innocent people to death simply because they had the misfortune to be loved by someone who lacked the wisdom to accept Rick Prime's superior perspective on reality and relationships. The portal that Rick Prime opened to deliver the bomb was Rick's first direct glimpse of the technology he had refused, a swirling vortex of green energy that connected their peaceful suburban home to dimensions unknown and possibilities beyond imagination. The portal gun itself was clearly based on theoretical principles similar to those Rick had been exploring, but refined through practical application and enhanced with exotic materials that suggested access to resources available only through multiversal travel. The ease with which Rick Prime manipulated space-time itself demonstrated capabilities that Rick might have developed if he had made different choices about family and responsibility. Rick's desperate attempt to stop the bomb failed not because of inadequate scientific knowledge, but because Rick Prime possessed decades of experience with violence and destruction that Rick completely lacked due to his focus on family and ethical research. The struggle was brief and one-sided, with Rick Prime displaying casual physical superiority that suggested enhancement through advanced technology or exposure to conditions that had transformed him into something beyond normal human limitations. Rick's hands closed on empty air as the bomb fell through the portal, carrying death toward his wife and daughter, while Rick Prime watched with amused satisfaction. The explosion that vaporized Diane and Beth was visible through the portal for exactly 3.7 seconds before Rick Prime closed the dimensional gateway, leaving behind only the memory of brilliant light that had instantly transformed Rick's reason for living into atomic particles scattered across space. The sound reached Rick's ears as a distant thunderclap that seemed impossibly quiet for something that had just destroyed everything meaningful in his existence. While the portal's closure eliminated any possibility of rescue or even recovery of bodies that might have provided focus for proper grief and mourning rituals. Rick Prime's parting words were delivered with the same casual cruelty that had characterized every aspect of their interaction, designed to inflict maximum psychological damage while also providing Rick with just enough information to understand the scope of his loss and the futility of any response he might attempt. Rick Prime had not simply killed Rick's family, but had chosen them specifically because they represented everything that Rick Prime had abandoned in his own dimensional travels, making their murder both personal revenge and philosophical statement about the weakness of emotional attachment. The promise that Rick Prime would return, If Rick ever developed portal technology, created an additional layer of psychological torture, ensuring that Rick's natural response to loss, throwing himself into work that might provide distraction from grief, would also carry the threat of additional violence against anyone he might learn to care about in the foe's future. Rick Prime had constructed a perfect psychological prison that would either prevent Rick from achieving technological advancement or ensure that such advancement would come at the cost of everyone else Rick might ever love. Rick's immediate response to his family's murder was complete psychological disintegration that no amount of scientific training had prepared him to manage effectively. The rational mind that had solved complex theoretical problems with elegant efficiency proved completely inadequate for processing the sudden transition from domestic happiness to absolute loss, leaving Rick kneeling in his driveway while neighbors emerged from their houses to investigate the distant explosion that had eliminated his reason for continued existence. The next several hours passed in a haze of police questions, neighbor sympathy, and official procedures that treated the most significant event in Rick's personal universe as routine tragedy requiring standard bureaucratic responses. Rick answered questions with mechanical precision, while his consciousness remained focused on the growing recognition that Rick Prime's casual cruelty had not been aberration, but rather the logical endpoint of the path that Rick himself might follow if he chose to develop similar technological capabilities in pursuit of revenge against his family's killer. The garage that had once been Rick's sanctuary of discovery and family bonding now felt like a monument to everything he had lost, filled with projects that would never be completed because their purpose had died with the people they were meant to serve. The theoretical frameworks he had developed for understanding parallel dimensions now seemed like cruel preparation for the horror that Rick Prime had inflicted. Mathematical relationships that described the very technology used to murder Diane and Beth with scientific precision that made their deaths feel predetermined rather than tragic. The decision to pursue portal technology was not made in a moment of dramatic resolution, but developed gradually through growing recognition that revenge was the only remaining goal that seemed capable of providing structure and meaning to continued existence. Rick found himself staring at equations that had once represented pure intellectual curiosity, but now pointed toward weapons that could reach across dimensions to destroy the monster who shared his face and had chosen to eliminate everything beautiful in Rick's particular version of reality. The psychological transformation that began on the day Rick Prime murdered his family would continue for decades, gradually converting a loving father and ethical scientist into something approaching a cosmic force of destruction disguised as justice-seeking. But the seeds of that transformation were planted in the moment Rick Prime's bomb fell through the portal, carrying away not just Diane and Beth, but also every moral constraint and emotional connection that had previously prevented Rick from becoming exactly the kind of monster who might casually destroy other people's families in pursuit of personal objectives. The stage was set for Rick's evolution from victim to victimizer, from protector to predator, from someone who refused power in favor of love, to someone who would eventually wield infinite power, while remaining incapable of the genuine, emotional connections that had once made existence meaningful. Rick Prime had not simply killed Rick's family, but had also murdered the man Rick had been, replacing him with someone who would spend decades becoming indistinguishable from the enemy he hunted across infinite realities, filled with infinite possibilities for causing suffering that could never adequately compensate for the enemy. Beautiful simplicity that had been lost forever on that perfect suburban morning when the multiverse first revealed its capacity for casual, devastating cruelty. The weeks that followed the murder of Diane and Beth passed in a psychological haze that transformed Rick's grief into something far more dangerous than simple mourning. A cold, calculating fury that would eventually consume not just his own humanity, but the lives of countless innocent people across infinite dimensions who had the misfortune to share his face and scientific capabilities. The garage that had once been filled with the sounds of family life now echoed only with the mechanical precision of a man systematically converting theoretical knowledge into practical weapons, each equation and prototype bringing him closer to the technological capabilities necessary for interdimensional revenge against the monster who had destroyed everything beautiful in his existence. Rick's initial attempts at portal technology were crude and unstable, producing brief tears in space-time that collapsed within seconds of formation. But each failure provided data that refined his understanding of the dimensional physics Rick Prime had demonstrated so casually during their fatal encounter. The mathematical frameworks Rick had developed during his years of peaceful research proved remarkably adaptable to weaponization, theoretical principles that had once explored the elegant structure of reality, now serving as foundation for technologies that could reach across infinite realities to deliver death and destruction with surgical precision. The transformation of Rick's personality during these months of obsessive research was gradual but inexorable. Each small compromise, with his former ethical standards paving the way for greater moral flexibility, as his quest for revenge demanded increasingly sophisticated approaches to violence and manipulation. The loving father who had once patiently explained scientific concepts to his curious daughter was slowly being replaced by someone who viewed other people primarily as obstacles or resources in his campaign against Rick Prime, their individual worth and dignity becoming secondary considerations compared to his overriding need for vengeance. Rick's first successful portal was a masterpiece of desperate engineering, cobbled together from exotic materials he had synthesized using techniques that pushed far beyond the boundaries of conventional chemistry and physics. The swirling green vortex that materialized in his garage represented not just technological breakthrough but psychological point of no return. The moment when Rick's theoretical understanding of interdimensional travel became practical capability for inserting himself into realities where other versions of himself lived similar to the one Rick Prime had destroyed, through casual cruelty and calculated malice. The dimension Rick chose for his first interdimensional journey was designated C-132, selected not through careful analysis of potential threats, but through simple proximity to his own reality's quantum signature, making it the easiest target to reach with his crude prototype portal gun. The Rick who lived in dimension C-132 was pursuing research projects nearly identical to Rick C-137's own pre-tragedy investigations, working in a garage laboratory that looked exactly like the workshop where Rick had once been happy with Diane and Beth, surrounded by the same tools and equations that had once represented hope for a better future rather than instruments of revenge. The murder of Rick C-132 was accomplished with clinical efficiency that surprised Rick with its psychological ease. The theoretical understanding of violence he had developed while designing weapons translating seamlessly into practical application that required no moral wrestling or emotional preparation. Rick C-132 died without understanding what was happening or why, his final moments filled with confusion rather than recognition of the cosmic justice that his killer believed he was delivering. The absence of satisfaction Rick felt after completing his first interdimensional murder was disturbing but not deterrent, simply additional data about the psychological requirements of his mission. Rick's systematic search through Rick C-132's research materials revealed no evidence that this particular alternate self had been Rick Prime or had any connection to the interdimensional technology used to murder Diane and Beth, making his death a complete waste that served no purpose beyond providing Rick with practical experience in crossing dimensional boundaries to eliminate targets. The recognition that he had killed an innocent man who might have eventually developed the same loving family relationships Rick had lost did not deter Rick from planning additional murders, merely refined his targeting criteria for future operations. The pattern that established itself over the following months was mechanically simple and psychologically devastating. Locate a dimension containing a Rick Sanchez, travel there using increasingly sophisticated portal technology, eliminate the target while searching for evidence of Rick Prime's identity, move on to the next reality when the investigation proved fruitless. Each murder became easier than the previous one, as Rick's moral inhibitions eroded under the constant pressure of his grief and his growing familiarity with violence as a tool for achieving objectives that conventional approaches could not address. Rick's portal gun underwent continuous refinement during this period, each interdimensional journey providing opportunities to observe how other Ricks had approached similar technological challenges, while also gathering exotic materials that could enhance the weapon's range, precision, and reliability. The device evolved from crude prototype to sophisticated instrument, capable of accessing thousands of dimensions with minimal energy expenditure. But more importantly, it evolved into extension of Rick's psychology that made multiversal travel feel as natural and routine as walking between rooms in his original house. The dimensions Rick visited during his early hunting expeditions revealed the vast scope of possible variation in human existence, while simultaneously demonstrating the essential similarity that connected all versions of himself across infinite realities. Some Ricks were more successful in their scientific careers, others happier in their family relationships, some more isolated and bitter, but all shared fundamental characteristics that made them recognizably the same person, despite different circumstances that had shaped their individual development and life choices. This recognition of similarity across dimensions had the paradoxical effect of making Rick's murders easier rather than harder, as he began to view his alternate selves not as unique individuals deserving moral consideration, but as variations on a theme that could be eliminated without meaningful loss to the broader structure of reality. Each Rick he killed was simply another iteration of the same basic pattern, replaceable and expendable in ways that individual people confined to single realities could never be, their deaths registering as statistical rather than personal tragedies. The psychological impact of systematic murder began manifesting in ways Rick initially dismissed as irrelevant side effects, but gradually recognized as fundamental changes in his capacity for normal human emotional responses. The moral framework that had once guided his research toward humanitarian applications and family welfare was systematically dismantled through repetitive exposure to violence, each kill requiring him to suppress ethical considerations that had previously seemed natural and automatic, rather than conscious choices requiring deliberate override. The accumulation of deaths began attracting attention from other Ricks who had developed their own portal technology and were monitoring dimensional frequencies for signs of interdimensional activity that might represent threats to their security or opportunities for collaboration. Rick's murders were not subtle operations. The sudden disappearance of Ricks from multiple dimensions created patterns that scientifically sophisticated versions of himself could detect and analyze using techniques similar to his own investigative methods. Some of the Ricks who discovered Rick's killing spree attempted to organize defensive measures through shared intelligence and coordinated security protocols, while others tried to track down the killer using interdimensional forensics and probability mathematics that Rick had not yet learned to conceal or counter effectively. But Rick's advantage in both technological development and practical experience with violence made him nearly impossible for isolated individuals to challenge successfully. even when they possessed similar scientific capabilities and theoretical understanding. The first direct confrontation between Rick and organized opposition from his alternate selves occurred in dimension C244, where a coalition of 3 Ricks had assembled to discuss the systematic elimination campaign they had detected across multiple realities. Rick's discovery of their meeting through dimensional surveillance equipment he had developed specifically for tracking other versions of himself led to his decision to attack preemptively rather than attempt infiltration or negotiation that might compromise his operational security. The battle in dimension C244 was Rick's introduction to combat against opponents who possessed capabilities similar to his own, requiring tactical thinking and weapons development that exceeded anything he had previously needed for eliminating unsuspecting targets, who had no reason to expect interdimensional assault. The 3 Ricks he faced had prepared defensive measures and coordinated strategies that forced Rick to develop new approaches to violence, while also revealing how much his personality had changed since beginning his hunt for Rick Prime. Rick's victory in Dimension C244 was achieved through superior preparation and willingness to accept collateral damage that his opponents were not psychologically equipped to match, but it also marked his transition from targeted assassination to open warfare against organized opposition from his own alternate selves. The explosive device he used to eliminate all 3 Ricks simultaneously was Rick's most efficient single act of violence since beginning his campaign, but it also demonstrated his complete abandonment of any pretense that his mission was limited to finding and punishing Rick Prime specifically. The survivors of Rick's attack on Dimension C244 spread word of his capabilities and ruthlessness throughout their networks of interdimensional contacts, creating a reputation that preceded Rick into subsequent realities and fundamentally changed the nature of his hunting operations. Ricks across multiple dimensions began developing countermeasures and early warning systems designed specifically to detect and repel the interdimensional killer who had declared war on all versions of himself, transforming Rick's quest for personal revenge into cosmic-scale conflict. The fear that other Ricks began displaying when confronted by Rick C-137 was simultaneously gratifying and psychologically corrosive, validating his evolution into something beyond normal human limitations, while also highlighting how completely he had diverged from the loving father and ethical scientist he had been before Rick Prime's bomb destroyed his capacity for normal emotional connections. The recognition in their eyes as they realized who he was and what he intended to do to them provided Rick with the closest approximation to satisfaction he could achieve in his post-tragedy existence. But the most psychologically damaging aspect of Rick's multiversal killing spree was not the violence itself, but the gradual recognition that his victims were not abstract enemies, but versions of himself who had made different choices and experienced different outcomes under similar circumstances. Each death eliminated not just a potential Rick Prime, but also a possibility for what Rick might have become if his own family had not been murdered, creating a form of existential vertigo that made it increasingly difficult to maintain stable sense of personal identity and moral purpose. The dimensions Rick abandoned after completing his murders were left to deal with the social and scientific disruption caused by the sudden elimination of their most brilliant scientific minds. But Rick felt no responsibility for these consequences because his victims' welfare had ceased to matter once he confirmed they were not Rick Prime. The civilizations that lost their Ricks to his campaign were acceptable casualties in his pursuit of a greater goal that justified any amount of collateral damage inflicted on innocent populations who had never chosen to participate in interdimensional conflict. Rick's portal gun technology continued evolving throughout his killing spree, incorporating innovations he observed in other dimensions and materials he harvested from the research facilities of his victims. But the weapon also evolved into psychological crutch that enabled his complete disconnection from normal moral categories and emotional responses. The ability to instantly travel between realities meant that consequences could always be escaped through dimensional abandonment. Relationships could always be replaced through interdimensional alternatives, and failures could always be corrected through access to realities where different choices had produced different outcomes. The years Rick spent hunting Rick Prime across infinite realities gradually transformed him from someone seeking justice for specific crimes into something approaching cosmic horror, whose very existence threatened the stability of interdimensional civilization. But perhaps more tragically, his campaign also transformed him into exactly the kind of being who could casually destroy innocent families in pursuit of personal objectives, the kind of Rick who might drop bombs through portals without considering the consequences for people whose only crime was loving someone that a more powerful Rick wanted to eliminate. The man who had once refused Rick Prime's offer because he valued love over power had become someone whose infinite power made love impossible, whose technological capabilities exceeded his emotional capacity, and whose quest for revenge had consumed not just his own humanity, but the lives of countless people who shared nothing with Rick Prime, except scientific curiosity and the misfortune of resembling the man whose family had been murdered in the forting. A peaceful suburban garage where a father had once helped his daughter with homework while dreaming of making the world a better place for everyone. The dimensional coordinates that would lead Rick to his replacement family came not through systematic searching, but through the kind of random chance that infinite realities make statistically inevitable. After years of fruitless hunting across countless dimensions, Rick's portal gun detected quantum signatures that matched the exact frequency of Rick Prime's interdimensional technology, leading him to a reality where the monster who had destroyed his life had once lived before abandoning yet another family to pursue his multiversal rampage of casual destruction and scientific superiority. Standing at the dimensional threshold that corresponded to his own home address in this alternate reality, Rick found himself experiencing emotions he had thought permanently buried beneath years of systematic murder and psychological hardening. The house that materialized through his portal was identical to the one where he had lived with Diane and Beth down to the smallest architectural details, the same paint color on the shutters, the same crack in the front sidewalk, the same garden layout where his wife had grown flowers that their daughter had loved to help tend during those perfect afternoons that now seemed like memories from someone else's life. But the similarity between this dimension and his own was superficial, masking profound differences that would prove more psychologically significant than anything visible from the street or detectable through dimensional analysis. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong with this reality's version of his family came from observing the house during the days Rick spent in careful surveillance before making direct contact with the people who lived behind walls that should have contained happiness, but instead seemed to radiate abandonment and disappointment. The windows remained dark, long past the hours when Diane should have been preparing breakfast and Beth should have been getting ready for school, while the driveway showed no evidence of recent vehicle use and the mailbox overflowed with accumulated correspondence that suggested prolonged absence rather than temporary travel. The domestic rhythms Rick remembered from his own destroyed family were completely absent from this supposedly identical household, replaced by the hollow silence of people who had learned not to expect reliability from someone they had once trusted completely. Rick's decision to approach the house directly rather than continuing his distant observation was motivated by growing certainty that Rick Prime was not present in this dimension and had not been for some time. that he had abandoned his original family just as casually as he had murdered Rick's wife and daughter. The portal device Rick discovered in the garage confirmed his suspicions. Sophisticated interdimensional technology sat unused and gathering dust, evidence that its creator had departed for destinations unknown and felt no obligation to maintain connections to his point of origin or the people who had shaped his early development. The confrontation with this dimension's version of Beth was Rick's first direct interaction with anyone resembling his family since the deaths of Diane and his own daughter years earlier, and the emotional impact was far more devastating than his years of psychological hardening had prepared him to handle effectively. This Beth was older than his own daughter had ever lived to become, a grown woman with her own accumulated experiences of disappointment and abandonment, but her face carried the same intelligent curiosity Rick remembered from his child, the same quick smile that had once brightened every day of his domestic existence. The adult Beth who opened the door to Rick's tentative knock was initially suspicious of the stranger who claimed to be her father, but her wariness was based on practical caution rather than inability to recognize the man who had shaped her early years before, disappearing into interdimensional adventures that apparently held more appeal than family. Responsibilities. Rick Prime's pattern of periodic appearances and unexplained departures had established expectations of unreliable presence that made Beth naturally defensive about emotional investments that might be withdrawn without warning or adequate explanation. Beth's first words to Rick were not expressions of joy at his return, but pointed questions about where he had been during his latest absence and whether he intended to stay long enough to justify the psychological effort of welcoming him back into family dynamics that had learned to function without his participation. Her tone carried accumulated resentment from years of broken promises and abandoned commitments, emotional scar tissue that had formed around the wounds left by Rick Prime's casual attitude toward parental obligations and family stability. Rick's realization that he was being mistaken for Rick Prime created an unexpected opportunity that he had not considered when beginning his hunt for his family's killer. This dimension's Beth had been abandoned by her original father just as completely as Rick had been abandoned by the universe that allowed random violence to destroy innocent lives, creating symmetrical patterns of loss and disappointment that made deception feel like mutual healing rather than calculated manipulation of grieving people who deserved better than continued exploitation. The decision to assume Rick Prime's identity and place in this family was made not through careful ethical consideration, but through desperate opportunism that bypassed Rick's normal, analytical processes and moral frameworks. He had spent years becoming a monster in pursuit of revenge against the Rick who had destroyed his original family. But this dimension offered him the chance to reclaim something approximating the domestic happiness he had lost, making the moral implications of deceiving innocent people seem like acceptable compromise compared to continued existence without meaningful human connections. Beth's introduction of Rick to her husband Jerry and their children Summer and Morty revealed the complete scope of the family structure Rick would be joining through his impersonation of their absent patriarch. Jerry's obvious discomfort with Rick's presence was based not on suspicion about his identity, but on well-founded anxiety about the disruption that Rick's return would inevitably cause to family dynamics that had developed coping mechanisms for his unreliability and emotional unavailability during previous temporary homecomings. Jerry had presumably spent years dealing with the emotional aftermath of his wife's abandonment by her father, providing stability and support, while Rick Prime pursued interdimensional adventures that apparently took priority over family relationships and domestic responsibilities. Rick's sudden reappearance represented potential threat to the psychological equilibrium Jerry had worked to maintain, especially given Rick Prime's history of treating family members as inconvenient obstacles to more important scientific pursuits rather than people deserving consideration and respect. Summer's reaction to Rick's arrival was filtered through adolescent sophistication about family dynamics and adult motivations, reflecting her understanding of how parental decisions affected children who had no voice in making them, but were forced to live with the consequences anyway. She was old enough to remember previous occasions when Rick Prime had returned temporarily, raising hopes and expectations that were inevitably disappointed. When he departed again, without adequate explanation or promise of future contact, making her naturally cautious about emotional investment in relationships that had proven historically unreliable. The guarded enthusiasm Summer displayed at seeing Rick again was tempered by protective concern for her younger brother and realistic assessment of Rick Prime's track record regarding family commitments and emotional availability. Her questions about Rick's plans and intentions were designed to gather intelligence that would help her manage family expectations and prepare for the emotional aftermath that would inevitably follow his next departure, whenever that might occur. And regardless of whatever promises he might make about changed priorities or renewed dedication to family welfare. But it was Morty's response to Rick's presence that proved most psychologically significant for Rick's adjustment to his role as replacement grandfather and his growing investment in relationships that were built on deception but felt increasingly genuine despite their false foundations. The 14-year-old boy had no clear memories of Rick Prime from earlier periods, having been too young during previous visits to form lasting impressions of his grandfather's personality or capabilities, making him the family member most open to accepting Rick at face value, rather than filtering interactions through accumulated disappointment and broken trust. This lack of preconceptions made Morty uniquely valuable to Rick, as someone who could provide authentic relationship experience, without the complications introduced by Rick Prime's history of abandonment and emotional manipulation. The boy's natural curiosity about his grandfather's work and adventures created opportunities for Rick to share knowledge and experiences that felt meaningful rather than performed, while Morty's obvious need for guidance and protection activated protective instincts that Rick had thought permanently destroyed by years of violence and systematic dehumanization of everyone outside his immediate circle of concern. The first weeks of Rick's integration into this alternate family structure required constant vigilance and careful performance as he attempted to fulfill his assumed role without revealing the deception that made his presence possible, or the accumulated psychological damage that years of interdimensional murder had inflicted on his capacity for normal emotional responses. Every conversation demanded navigation between his actual memories and experiences and the personal history that Rick Prime should have developed during his life in this dimension, while every interaction with family members forced suppression of genuine responses in favor of behaviors consistent with their expectations. The emotional toll of maintaining this elaborate deception was compounded by constant reminders of what Rick had lost when his original family was murdered by the man whose identity he had stolen. Beth's laugh was identical to his daughter's, but belonged to a woman whose adult experiences and developed personality reflected decades of growth Rick had never witnessed or influenced. Jerry's anxieties about family stability echoed concerns Rick's own Diane might have expressed if she had lived to see their daughter navigate the complexities of marriage and parenthood under the shadow of an unreliable father. Summer's adolescent challenges and social difficulties resembled problems Rick's own Beth might have faced if she had survived to raise children of her own, while her protective attitude toward Morty demonstrated family loyalty that Rick found simultaneously admirable and painful because it highlighted relationships he would never have the opportunity to develop with his actual grandchildren. Every family dinner and holiday celebration became exercise in psychological archaeology as Rick tried to imagine how his original life might have unfolded if Rick Prime's bomb had never fallen through that portal. But it was the relationship that developed between Rick and Morty that provided the most unexpected source of emotional healing and psychological stability during Rick's adjustment to his stolen family identity. The grandson he had never had the opportunity to know in his original dimension proved remarkably similar to what his own Beth might have produced under different circumstances. Intelligent but lacking confidence, curious but easily intimidated, fundamentally kind but frequently taken advantage by those who should have provided protection and guidance rather than exploitation. The scientific education Rick began providing Morty was motivated initially by need to maintain his grandfather performance and demonstrate the kind of advanced capabilities Rick Prime should possess, but gradually became authentic expression of Rick's desire to share knowledge that might help the boy develop skills and confidence necessary for navigating an increasingly complex and dangerous world. The portal technology that made interdimensional field trips possible transformed ordinary afternoons into educational adventures that satisfied both Rick's need to justify his presence and Morty's natural curiosity about realities beyond his immediate experience. The family adventures that became regular features of Rick and Morty's relationship served multiple psychological functions beyond simple entertainment and education. They provided Rick with ongoing validation of his superior capabilities, while giving him opportunities to demonstrate protective value to family members who had learned to expect disappointment rather than support from father figures. But more importantly, they offered Rick the chance to experience genuine pride in someone else's development and achievement, emotions he had not felt since watching his original Beth master new skills in his garage workshop decades earlier. Rick's attempts to fulfill the role of returning patriarch were complicated by his complete lack of experience with extended family relationships and his tendency to approach emotional situations with analytical detachment rather than intuitive understanding of human needs and motivations. His efforts to show interest in Summer's social activities resulted in awkward conversations that revealed how little he understood about normal adolescent concerns, while his attempts to provide grandfatherly advice often took forms that confused rather than helped his supposed grandchildren navigate age-appropriate challenges. The household dynamics Rick had to learn and navigate were far more complex than the simple nuclear family structure he remembered from his life with Diane and Beth, involving ongoing tensions between Jerry and Beth that reflected years of marital stress exacerbated by Rick Prime's intermittent presence and emotional unavailability. Jerry's resentment toward Rick was based not just on personal antipathy, but on legitimate concern about Rick's influence on family stability and his tendency to prioritize scientific interests over domestic responsibilities and emotional support for people who needed reliable father figure rather than brilliant but unreliable genius. Beth's conflicted feelings about Rick's return created additional complications as she struggled to balance her desire for paternal relationship with realistic assessment of Rick Prime's historical reliability and genuine concern for her children's emotional welfare. Her intelligence made her naturally suspicious of sudden personality changes or shifts in priorities that seemed inconsistent with Rick Prime's established patterns, forcing Rick to modulate his behavior carefully to avoid triggering questions he could not answer without revealing his true identity and the circumstances that had brought him to their dimension. Rick's workshop in the garage of his adopted family's home became both sanctuary, where he could pursue actual research interests, and performance space, where he had to demonstrate the kind of advanced scientific capabilities that Rick Prime should possess based on his interdimensional travels and accumulated knowledge. The equipment and projects he maintained there served multiple purposes, advancing his own understanding of portal physics and dimensional mechanics, providing educational opportunities for Morty, and creating evidence of ongoing work that would justify his reputation as brilliant scientist whose absence had been motivated by important research rather than simple abandonment of family responsibilities. The success of Rick's integration into this alternate family structure was measured not by completeness of his deception, but by authenticity of connections he developed with each family member despite false foundations underlying their relationships. Morty's growing confidence and expanding curiosity provided evidence that Rick's guidance was beneficial regardless of his motivations or the deceptive circumstances that had made their relationship possible. While Beth's gradual relaxation in his presence suggested she was finding value in their interactions even if they were based on incomplete information about his identity and personal history. The irony of Rick's situation was not lost on him during quiet moments when he could step back from daily performance requirements and assess what he had achieved through his assumption of Rick Prime's abandoned family role. He had spent years becoming everything he despised in pursuit of revenge against Rick Prime, transforming himself into a multiversal monster capable of casual violence and systematic murder. But his theft of Rick Prime's family had provided him with emotional connections that made continued existence seem worthwhile, rather than simply extended exercise in justified violence and cosmic-scale revenge. The love he felt for Morty and his complicated affection for the other family members were genuine emotions that coexisted uneasily with his capacity for interdimensional murder and his fundamental disregard for welfare of people outside his immediate circle of concern. The man who could eliminate alternate versions of himself without hesitation was also capable of patient instruction and protective care for children who had become his responsibility through elaborate deception, creating internal contradictions that no amount of rationalization could resolve satisfactorily. As Rick settled into rhythms of family life in this dimension, he began to understand that his hunt for Rick Prime had transformed him into someone who was no longer entirely human but was not yet completely monstrous. Someone whose capacity for love remained real, despite being constrained by his multiversal perspective and his accumulated experience with violence as solution to problems that conventional approaches could not address adequately. The stage was set for years of adventure and family bonding that would test both his ability to maintain his deception and his capacity for genuine emotional growth, despite the psychological damage inflicted by decades of systematic revenge. The transition from Rick's careful integration into his replacement family to the chaotic adventures that would define their relationship began with what should have been a simple grandfather's gesture: Rick's decision to help Morty overcome his social anxieties and romantic frustrations through the application of advanced scientific knowledge to ordinary teenage problems. The love potion Rick created for Morty's crush on Jessica was intended as minor intervention that would boost the boy's confidence while demonstrating Rick's value as mentor and protector, but the casual approach Rick took to manipulating human brain chemistry revealed how completely his years of interdimensional violence had severed his connection to normal considerations about consent, consequences, and the fundamental dignity of other people's autonomy. The potion itself was a masterpiece of neurochemical engineering that showcased Rick's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and biological systems, but it was also a weapon of mass destruction disguised as grandfatherly assistance, capable of spreading through airborne transmission and fundamentally altering the brain chemistry of anyone exposed to its effects. Rick's failure to consider safety protocols or potential side effects demonstrated his unconscious assumption that other people's welfare was less important than achieving desired outcomes efficiently, a perspective that had developed through years of treating entire dimensions as disposable resources in his hunt for Rick Prime. The escalation from Morty's simple request for romantic help to global pandemic happened with terrifying speed as Rick's love potion interacted with human biology in ways his theoretical knowledge had not predicted or prepared him to control. Within hours of Jessica's initial exposure at the school dance, the entire population of Earth had been transformed into aggressive creatures whose obsession with Morty threatened not just his personal safety, but the basic structure of human civilization itself, creating exactly the kind of catastrophic scenario that Rick's original ethical framework would have prevented through careful consideration of potential consequences. Rick's response to the worldwide catastrophe he had created was characteristically analytical and devoid of emotional investment in outcomes that affected people outside his immediate family circle. His primary concern was not the suffering of billions of infected humans, or the collapse of social institutions that had taken centuries to develop, but rather the practical inconvenience that the situation posed for his and Morty's continued, comfortable existence in a dimension that no longer functioned according to normal parameters of safety and predictability. The antidote Rick developed to address the love potion crisis was designed with the same casual disregard for human welfare that had characterized his original intervention, creating secondary effects that were arguably worse than the initial problem, while solving only the immediate threat to their personal security. The transformation of Earth's love-crazed population into horrifying genetic mutations represented Rick's approach to problem-solving through escalation rather than careful remediation, treating symptoms rather than underlying causes, while creating new forms of suffering that exceeded the original disaster in both scope and permanence. The decision to abandon their ruined dimension rather than attempt comprehensive solution to the crisis Rick had created marked a crucial turning point in his relationship with Morty and his approach to family responsibilities that would establish patterns lasting for years of subsequent adventures. The process of locating a replacement dimension where their alternate selves had died in an unrelated accident required no more emotional investment from Rick than selecting a new laboratory when his current workspace became contaminated. But for Morty, the experience represented fundamental break with everything he had understood about identity, consequence, and the significance of individual existence. Rick's casual efficiency in managing their dimensional relocation contrasted sharply with Morty's psychological trauma at discovering his own corpse in the backyard of their new home, a juxtaposition that revealed the vast gulf between Rick's multiversal perspective and normal human attachment to particular versions of reality and relationship. The burial ceremony Rick insisted they perform was presented as necessary practical measure rather than meaningful ritual, but it served to initiate Morty into Rick's worldview, where people and places were interchangeable resources rather than irreplaceable treasures deserving moral consideration and emotional investment. The new family that welcomed Rick and Morty in their replacement dimension was identical to the one they had abandoned in every superficial respect. But Rick's knowledge that these were not the same people created additional layers of deception that further complicated his already strained relationship with authentic emotion and genuine human connection. Beth's expressions of love for Rick were directed toward a version of him that had never existed in this dimension, while Jerry's antagonism was based on experiences with a Rick who had died in an explosion before Rick's arrival, making every interaction a performance based on fictional shared history. Morty's adjustment to their new dimensional home was hindered by his growing awareness that the relationships he valued most were built on foundations of systematic deception and casual manipulation that Rick treated as necessary but unremarkable aspects of their adventures together. The boy's questions about the ethical implications of dimension hopping and identity replacement received responses from Rick that were technically accurate, but revealed complete absence of normal moral reasoning about their obligations to the people whose lives they had assumed without consent or acknowledgement. The family adventures that became regular features of Rick and Morty's relationship during this period served multiple functions beyond entertainment and education. They provided Rick with ongoing validation of his superior capabilities, while also creating shared experiences that bonded them together through excitement and danger that ordinary grandfathers could never offer their grandsons. The portal technology that made interdimensional travel routine transformed Rick into the most interesting person in Morty's world, while also making him dependent on Rick's protection and guidance in situations that exceeded normal human understanding and survival capabilities. Rick's approach to adventure selection was governed by his need to maintain intellectual stimulation and demonstrate technological superiority, rather than consideration of age-appropriate challenges or educational value for his grandson's development. The exotic locations they visited and alien civilizations they encountered were chosen based on Rick's boredom and curiosity, rather than Morty's readiness to handle complex moral situations or exposure to forms of violence and corruption that no 14-year-old should be expected to process successfully without psychological damage. The weapons training Rick provided Morty was presented as necessary practical education for survival in dangerous situations, but it also represented systematic desensitization to violence that gradually eroded the boy's natural moral inhibitions about harming other sentient beings. The casual way Rick handed deadly weapons to his grandson, while expecting him to use them effectively in combat situations, revealed his assumption that Morty's innocence was liability rather than valuable characteristic, deserving protection and preservation through careful exposure to age-appropriate challenges. Morty's gradual adaptation to Rick's moral flexibility and casual violence was both necessary for his survival during their adventures and profoundly damaging to his psychological development as someone who had once possessed clear ethical frameworks and emotional responses appropriate to his age and social background. The boy, who had initially been traumatized by burying his own corpse, learned to accept dimension abandonment as routine solution to problems that Rick's interventions had created or exacerbated beyond conventional repair. The pattern that emerged from their early adventures together established template for Rick's approach to family relationships that would persist throughout their subsequent experiences. Genuine care for his loved ones, immediate welfare, combined with complete disregard for consequences that affected people outside his circle of concern. Sophisticated problem-solving applied to crises that his own actions had created or intensified, and systematic erosion of other people's moral autonomy, justified through claims about his superior understanding of cosmic realities and practical necessities. Rick's growing reliance on alcohol during this period was not recreational indulgence but medicinal necessity, designed to numb psychological pain and philosophical anxiety that threatened to overwhelm his functional capabilities when he allowed himself to acknowledge the full implications of his transformation from loving father to cosmic monster. The drinking served as chemical buffer between his conscious awareness and the accumulated guilt from years of interdimensional murder, combined with ongoing deception of people who trusted him with their emotional welfare and physical safety. The technological projects Rick pursued in his garage laboratory became increasingly elaborate and disconnected from practical applications that might benefit his family or address genuine human needs. representing instead complex intellectual exercises designed to occupy his mind with problems sufficiently challenging to prevent dwelling on questions about meaning and purpose that had no satisfactory answers within his current philosophical framework. The inventions he created were marvels of scientific achievement, but often caused more problems than they solved, due to Rick's tendency to prioritize technical elegance over consideration of ethical implications. Rick's interactions with Jerry during this period revealed his fundamental inability to respect people whose intellectual capabilities he perceived as inferior to his own, creating ongoing family tensions that Beth was forced to mediate, despite her own conflicted feelings about her father's behavior and priorities. Jerry's legitimate concerns about Rick's influence on the children were dismissed as jealousy and incompetence, rather than reasonable parental anxiety about exposing minors to dangerous situations and morally corrupting influences that no amount of scientific advancement could justify or adequately address. The adventures Rick shared with Summer during her occasional participation in interdimensional travel provided additional evidence of his casual attitude toward exposing family members to threats and challenges that exceeded their preparation or psychological readiness to handle successfully. Summer's adolescent need for excitement and validation made her eager participant in activities that satisfied her desire for uniqueness, while also demonstrating Rick's favoritism toward family members who appreciated his capabilities rather than questioning his methods or motivations. Beth's growing dependence on Rick's presence and approval created psychological dynamics that made it increasingly difficult for her to maintain boundaries around his behavior or hold him accountable for decisions that affected family stability and her children's welfare. The daughter, who had spent years learning to function without her father's involvement, found herself gradually surrendering autonomy and parental authority to someone whose moral framework had been fundamentally compromised by experiences she could not understand or adequately evaluate for their impact on family relationships. The neighborhood and community context within which Rick's adventures took place became increasingly irrelevant, as his multiversal perspective made local concerns and social obligations seem trivial compared to cosmic scale problems and opportunities that portal technology made accessible on a daily basis. The ordinary human relationships that had once provided structure and meaning for family life were gradually displaced by interdimensional experiences that made conventional social interactions feel boring and insignificant by comparison. Rick's reputation among his interdimensional counterparts began to evolve during this period, as other Ricks became aware of his domestic arrangements and his apparent success in maintaining family relationships while pursuing advanced scientific research and multiversal adventures. The combination of technological superiority and emotional connections made him simultaneously enviable and suspicious to alternate versions of himself who had chosen different approaches to balancing personal fulfillment with family responsibilities, creating potential for conflicts that extended beyond his original hunt for Rick Prime. The weapons and defensive systems Rick installed in the family home were presented as necessary security measures, but also served as constant reminders of the dangers his presence attracted to people who had never chosen to become targets of interdimensional threats and cosmic scale conflicts. The normalization of extreme violence and advanced weaponry in domestic settings reflected Rick's inability to separate his family life from the broader context of multiversal warfare and scientific competition that had consumed his identity since losing his original wife and daughter. The psychological toll of maintaining dual identity as loving grandfather and cosmic-scale threat was evident in Rick's increasing volatility during family interactions and his tendency to respond to minor conflicts with disproportionate technological solutions that treated interpersonal problems as engineering challenges rather than opportunities for emotional growth and improved communication. The man who could solve any technical problem remained helpless when faced with human needs that required vulnerability and authentic emotional engagement rather than superior knowledge and advanced capabilities. As Rick and Morty settled into patterns of regular interdimensional adventure punctuated by attempts at normal family life, they established foundation for years of escalating experiences that would test both Rick's ability to protect his chosen family and his capacity for maintaining human connections, despite his fundamental alienation from conventional moral frameworks and emotional responses. The stage was set for increasingly complex challenges that would force confrontations between Rick's cosmic perspective and his domestic commitments, ultimately leading to revelations about the true nature of his identity and the scope of his deception that no amount of genuine affection could indefinitely postpone or adequately resolve through continued adventure and mutual dependence. The discovery of the Citadel of Ricks represented Rick's first confrontation with the systematic organization that his years of multiversal murder had inadvertently created, a bureaucratic nightmare born from the collective terror of alternate versions of himself who had banded together for mutual protection against the interdimensional killer, whose reputation had spread across countless realities like a plague of fear and anticipation. The arrest that brought Rick and Morty to this monument of Rick narcissism was conducted with military precision by Ricks, who had abandoned individual autonomy in favor of collective security, trading the intellectual independence that defined their species for the safety that only numbers and coordination could provide against threats that exceeded individual capability to counter. The Citadel itself was a masterpiece of Rick engineering, applied to the problem of Rick psychology, a floating city designed to accommodate thousands of alternate versions of the same brilliant, paranoid, and fundamentally antisocial personality, while somehow maintaining enough order to function as governing body and defensive alliance. The architecture reflected Rick aesthetics taken to their logical extreme. Sleek technological surfaces, interrupted by chaotic improvisations, advanced materials, shaped into forms that prioritized function over beauty, and security systems sophisticated enough to contain beings whose individual capabilities approached godlike levels of destruction and manipulation. Rick's first glimpse of organized Rick society revealed the full scope of what his multiversal killing spree had accomplished beyond simple revenge against individual targets. He had forced his alternate selves to confront their own mortality and vulnerability in ways that their superior intelligence had previously enabled them to avoid through technological solutions and dimensional escape. The Citadel represented collective acknowledgement that even the smartest beings in their respective universes could be threatened by forces that exceeded their individual ability to predict or counter through conventional scientific methods. The charges brought against Rick C-137 were comprehensive and damning: 27 counts of Rick murder across multiple dimensions, systematic disruption of interdimensional commerce and scientific collaboration, and creation of multiversal instability that threatened the basic structure of reality itself in regions where his activities had destabilized quantum foundations underlying dimensional barriers. The evidence presented by the prosecution was overwhelmingly convincing because it was entirely accurate, documenting years of systematic violence that Rick had never bothered to conceal because he had not anticipated organized opposition from victims capable of coordinating investigative and defensive responses. Rick's defense against these charges was not denial of the killings, but rather justification based on his hunt for Rick Prime and his right to pursue justice against the monster who had murdered his family, while other Ricks remained, safely isolated in their own dimensions without offering assistance or even acknowledgement that such crimes deserved collective response. His argument that the Citadel represented cowardly bureaucracy designed to protect comfortable lives rather than address genuine threats revealed his fundamental contempt for safety-seeking behavior and his belief that superior intelligence carried obligations to act decisively, regardless of conventional moral constraints. The trial proceedings revealed the extent to which Citadel society had developed elaborate procedures for managing Rick psychology, while somehow maintaining enough order to function as judicial system capable of evaluating crimes that exceeded normal legal frameworks. The judges who presided over Rick's case were alternate versions of himself, who had accepted limitations on their individual freedom in exchange for collective security and social stability, representing philosophical paths that Rick C. 137 had rejected in favor of absolute autonomy and personal vendetta prosecution. Rick's contempt for Citadel authority was evident in every aspect of his behavior during the trial, from his casual dismissal of legal procedures to his obvious boredom, with testimony that documented his systematic campaign of interdimensional murder. His attitude conveyed not remorse for his actions, but rather annoyance at having to justify necessary violence to people whose comfortable existence had been purchased through willful ignorance of genuine threats that required more decisive responses than bureaucratic committees and legal procedures could provide. The revelation that other Ricks had been murdered recently in patterns similar to Rick C. 137's historical killing spree created complications that exceeded the Citadel's institutional capability to investigate and resolve through conventional law enforcement methods. The new murders followed different tactical approaches and targeted different categories of victims, suggesting that Rick C. 137's influence had inspired copycat killers, or that entirely separate threats were exploiting the chaos his activities had created to pursue their own multiversal agendas. Rick's escape from Citadel custody was accomplished through superior preparation and technological capabilities that the prison system had not been designed to contain, but more importantly, through psychological manipulation of security personnel, whose Rick psychology he understood better than they understood themselves. The chaos he created during his breakout revealed fundamental weaknesses in institutional approaches to managing beings whose individual capabilities approached cosmic-scale threat levels while their emotional needs remained essentially human, and therefore predictable to someone with sufficient insight into their psychological patterns. The investigation that Rick conducted into the actual perpetrator of the recent murders led him through the darkest corners of Citadel society, revealing systematic exploitation and abuse that contradicted the organization's public commitment to Rick welfare and multiversal stability. The torture facilities hidden beneath official government buildings contained evidence of cruelty that exceeded anything Rick had witnessed during his own years of violence, suggesting that organized Rick society had developed its own capacity for evil that surpassed individual Rick brutality through systematic application of superior intelligence to problems of causing maximum suffering. The discovery of the Morty torture dome represented Rick's first encounter with the theoretical framework that would later prove central to understanding multiversal power dynamics and the relationship between Rick intelligence, Morty vulnerability across infinite realities. The explanation that Morty brainwaves served as camouflage for Rick activities was presented as scientific fact rather than moral justification, but it revealed philosophical assumptions about the expendability of less intelligent beings that characterized Rick thinking across multiple dimensions and organizational structures. Rick's horror at discovering systematic Morty torture was not based on sudden development of moral conscience, but rather on recognition that such activities threatened the safety and stability of his own Morty, whose welfare had become central to Rick's psychological equilibrium and sense of purpose following his integration into replacement family dynamics. The torture chamber forced Rick to confront the logical endpoint of his own casual attitude toward people whose intelligence he considered inferior to his own, revealing how his philosophical frameworks could justify atrocities when applied systematically by institutions rather than individuals. The revelation that evil Rick was not the true mastermind behind the torture operation, but rather a puppet controlled by his own Morty created fundamental challenges to Rick's understanding of intelligence, hierarchies, and power, relationships that had structured his worldview since achieving technological superiority over normal humans. The possibility that someone he had dismissed as inherently inferior could develop capabilities that exceeded Rick's intelligence, while remaining undetected for extended periods, suggested threats to his security that his normal analytical approaches had failed to anticipate or prepare for adequately. Evil Morty's casual efficiency in manipulating both Rick's psychology and Citadel security systems demonstrated strategic thinking and long-term planning capabilities that normal Mortys should not have been able to develop, regardless of exposure to Rick technology and multiversal experiences. The sophistication of his deception and the scope of his torture operations suggested evolution beyond typical Morty limitations through methods that Rick could not immediately understand or replicate, creating existential anxiety about his own assumptions regarding intelligence, power, and the predictability of people he considered his intellectual inferiors. The psychological implications of discovering that a version of his beloved grandson had become a monster comparable to himself forced Rick to confront uncomfortable questions about his own influence on Morty's development and the potential consequences of exposing impressionable young people to the realities of multiversal existence and advanced technological capabilities. The care he had taken to protect Morty from the worst aspects of their adventures was revealed as insufficient when faced with evidence that alternate versions of their relationship had produced outcomes where the supposed victim had developed capabilities exceeding his supposedly protective grandfather. Evil Morty's motivations for orchestrating systematic Rick torture were not explained through simple revenge narratives, but rather through sophisticated philosophical frameworks about the nature of intelligence, power, and the obligations that superior beings owed to those they claimed to protect. His actions suggested understanding of Rick's psychology that exceeded what most Ricks possessed about themselves, while his methods demonstrated tactical sophistication that had successfully manipulated entire institutions designed specifically to contain and control Rick-level threats. The torture techniques Evil Morty had developed specifically for Rick subjects revealed intimate knowledge of Rick's psychology, combined with complete absence of empathy or moral constraint about inflicting suffering on beings whose intelligence should have commanded respect rather than sadistic exploitation. The systematic nature of the torture suggested long-term planning and resource allocation that exceeded what individual Morty should have been capable of organizing without assistance from other Ricks or access to institutional resources that his public identity should not have been able to command. Rick's investigation into Evil Morty's background and development history revealed gaps in Citadel record-keeping that suggested either institutional incompetence or deliberate concealment of information that might have enabled earlier detection of the threat he represented. The absence of documentation about evil Morty's original Rick and the circumstances that had led to his placement within Citadel society created suspicions about systematic failures in Rick oversight and security protocols that had enabled unprecedented infiltration and manipulation. The revelation that evil Rick had been controlled through advanced cybernetic implants demonstrated technological capabilities that exceeded standard Rick achievements, while also revealing evil Morty's willingness to transform other beings into tools for achieving his objectives regardless of their consent or autonomous preferences. The casual efficiency with which evil Morty had converted his own Rick into controllable puppet suggested comfort with techniques that normal Mortys should have found psychologically impossible to contemplate or implement. The escape mechanism that evil Morty had prepared for his exposure suggested contingency planning that exceeded normal Morty intellectual capabilities, while also demonstrating access to resources and technologies that should have been beyond his ability to acquire or develop independently. His successful disappearance from Citadel custody revealed preparation that had anticipated multiple failure modes and developed countermeasures for each possible scenario that investigators might pursue. The aftermath of the evil Morty revelation left the Citadel with fundamental questions about their security procedures and philosophical assumptions regarding Morty intelligence and loyalty that threatened the basic foundations of their society and defensive strategies. The recognition that Mortys could develop beyond their expected limitations while remaining undetected for extended periods created paranoia about potential infiltration and subversion that exceeded their institutional capacity to investigate or counter through conventional methods. Rick's departure from the Citadel following the evil Morty incident was conducted with mutual recognition that his presence created more problems than his cooperation could solve, but also with acknowledgement that his unique perspective and experiences might be valuable for addressing future threats that exceeded normal Citadel capabilities. The offer of citizenship and formal membership in Rick's society was extended and declined with understanding that Rick C. 137's psychological needs and operational methods were incompatible with institutional constraints and collective decision-making process. The impact of the Citadel experience on Rick's relationship with his own Morty was profound but largely unspoken, creating new levels of protective concern combined with suspicion about Morty's long-term development potential that Rick was not equipped to address through conventional grandfather-grandson relationship dynamics. The knowledge that alternate versions of Morty could evolve into cosmic-scale threats while maintaining superficial appearance of innocence and vulnerability created ongoing anxiety about signs and symptoms that might indicate similar evolution in his own dimension. The philosophical questions raised by the evil Morty revelation extended beyond immediate security concerns to encompass fundamental assumptions about intelligence, power, and moral development that had structured Rick's worldview since achieving technological superiority over normal human limitations. The possibility that beings he had dismissed as inherently inferior could develop capabilities that exceeded his own, while remaining motivated by value systems he could not predict or understand, created existential anxiety that no amount of scientific advancement or technological preparation could adequately address. As Rick and Morty returned to their dimensional home following their traumatic introduction to organized Rick society and the discovery of evil Morty's capabilities, they carried with them knowledge that fundamentally altered their understanding of their relationship and the potential consequences of continued interdimensional adventures that exposed them to threats exceeding individual Rick ability to anticipate or counter through superior intelligence and advanced technology alone. The transformation of Rick from escaped prisoner to puppet master, orchestrating the complete reorganization of his family's emotional relationships, represented perhaps the most sophisticated manipulation campaign he had ever conducted, demonstrating capabilities that exceeded his previous achievements in interdimensional warfare, while revealing how completely his genius had been corrupted by years of treating other people as variables in equations designed to produce outcomes that served his strategic objectives rather than their genuine welfare and autonomy. The imprisonment that should have marked the end of his multiversal activities instead became the catalyst for proving that no institution or authority could contain someone whose understanding of psychology and technology had evolved beyond normal categories of threat assessment and containment. Protocol. The Galactic Federation's interrogation techniques represented the pinnacle of their civilization's understanding of consciousness, manipulation, and memory extraction. Sophisticated virtual reality systems, designed to break down psychological defenses through carefully calibrated experiences that exploited universal fears and desires, while monitoring neural responses for signs of deception or resistance. But their methods proved laughably inadequate when applied to a mind that had spent decades manipulating reality itself. Someone whose consciousness could navigate their artificial environments with the same casual superiority he brought to solving routine technical problems in his garage laboratory. Rick's performance during the interrogation process was a masterpiece of calculated deception that mixed genuine traumatic memories with deliberate falsehoods in proportions designed to achieve maximum psychological impact on his captors, while also serving his own strategic objectives for escape and revenge against the organization that had dared to challenge his autonomy. The fabricated elements of his backstory were crafted with sufficient emotional authenticity to convince sophisticated lie detection systems, while the genuine components provided foundation of truth that made his deceptions nearly impossible to distinguish from factual confession. The revelation of Rick's tragic history to his interrogators served multiple purposes. Beyond simple misdirection of law enforcement resources and attention, it provided Rick with a form of cathartic confession that acknowledged his real losses without revealing the subsequent transformation that had made him into exactly the kind of monster who might casually destroy other people's families in pursuit of personal objectives. The performance allowed him to process genuine grief while maintaining emotional detachment necessary for systematic manipulation of everyone involved in his capture and detention. But perhaps most significantly, Rick's presentation of his backstory marked his first explicit acknowledgement that his hunt for Rick Prime had fundamentally altered his relationship to truth and morality in ways that made conventional categories of hero and villain inadequate for understanding his current psychological state and operational methods. The casual dismissal of his own tragic history as fabrication designed to manipulate his audience revealed how completely he had internalized nihilistic frameworks that treated even his most profound experiences as potential tools rather than meaningful aspects of his identity, deserving respect and authentic expression. The economic warfare that Rick unleashed against the Galactic Federation from within their supposedly secure detention facility demonstrated technological capabilities and strategic thinking that exceeded anything their security analysts had imagined possible for imprisoned subject with limited access to external resources and communication systems. The systematic manipulation of their currency valuation algorithms required not just technical expertise but also sophisticated understanding of economic theory and sociological patterns that enabled him to predict cascading failures across their entire civilization with mathematical precision. The elegant simplicity of Rick's escape plan changing a single digit in the Federation's financial systems, created consequences that propagated throughout their interstellar economy, with devastating efficiency that collapsed governments, destabilized trade relationships, and eliminated the economic incentives that maintained cooperation between member worlds. The casual indifference with which Rick observed the destruction of institutions that had provided security and prosperity for billions of beings revealed how completely his multiversal perspective had severed his connection to normal. Moral considerations about collective welfare and individual suffering, the immediate transition from escaped prisoner seeking freedom to strategic manipulator, orchestrating wholesale reorganization of his family's emotional dynamics, revealed Rick's ability to apply the same analytical frameworks that had enabled his prison escape to problems of human psychology and relationship management. The systematic approach he brought to eliminating Jerry as source of opposition to his authority demonstrated planning and preparation that had been conducted entirely within his own mind while maintaining facade of helpless captivity. Rick's orchestration of Beth and Jerry's divorce represented his most sophisticated manipulation of people he claimed to care about, exploiting intimate knowledge of their personalities, insecurities, and relationship patterns to produce outcomes that served his control objectives, while appearing to result from their own independent choices and emotional developments. The timing of his dramatic return had been calculated to create psychological conditions that made Beth more receptive to choosing her father over her husband, while providing Jerry with evidence of disloyalty that justified his exclusion from family decision-making processes. The economic chaos Rick had created through his escape provided perfect cover for personal manipulations that might otherwise have seemed suspiciously convenient or deliberately orchestrated by someone with access to information and prosumo, capabilities that exceeded normal family member resources. Beth's natural tendency to idealize her father's heroic qualities was amplified by his apparent success in single-handedly defeating interstellar government that had threatened their family's safety and stability, creating emotional conditions that made questioning his motives or methods seem like betrayal of someone who had sacrificed everything for their protection. Jerry's obvious relief at Rick's initial capture provided Rick with ammunition for psychological warfare that exploited legitimate marital tensions and insecurities that had been developing for years before Rick's arrival in their dimension. The evidence of Jerry's secret satisfaction at Rick's imprisonment could be weaponized to demonstrate disloyalty and self-interest that justified Beth's growing preference for her father's support over her husband's emotional needs and practical concerns about family, stability, and Rick's influence on their children's development. Rick's confession to Morty about his deliberate manipulation of his parents' divorce marked a crucial turning point in their relationship that revealed the full scope of psychological transformation Rick had undergone since losing his original family and beginning his multiversal campaign of revenge and replacement family acquisition. The casual efficiency with which he explained his strategic thinking to traumatized 14-year-old boy demonstrated not just indifference to Morty's emotional welfare, but also confidence that his control over family dynamics was so complete that acknowledgement of his manipulations carried no risk of meaningful resistance or consequence. The threat Rick made to deny any confession if Morty reported his manipulations to other family members revealed sophisticated understanding of family psychology and power dynamics that enabled his continued control over people who should have been capable of resisting his influence through conventional support systems and reality testing with trusted confidants. Rick's recognition that his heroic status following the Federation escape would make his word more credible than Morty's accusations demonstrated strategic thinking that had anticipated and neutralized potential sources of opposition before they could develop into genuine threats. The psychological pressure Rick applied to Morty through this revelation was designed not just to ensure silence about specific manipulations, but to establish broader patterns of complicity and shared responsibility that would make future resistance increasingly difficult as Morty became invested in maintaining family stability that depended on continued deception. The burden of secret knowledge about Rick's methods created emotional isolation that made Morty more dependent on Rick's guidance and approval, while reducing his capacity for independent moral reasoning about their relationship. The existential crisis Rick created for Beth through his casual revelation of her similarity to himself represented perhaps his most destructive manipulation during this period, targeting fundamental aspects of her identity and moral framework in ways designed to create long-term emotional dependence on his validation and philosophical guidance. The childhood inventions he had created for her were reframed not as evidence of irresponsible parenting, but as proof of inherent capacity for brilliant creativity that conventional morality was inadequate to contain or direct toward socially acceptable outcomes. Beth's growing recognition that she shared Rick's intellectual capabilities and moral flexibility created identity crisis that made her increasingly receptive to his philosophical frameworks while undermining her confidence in the ethical constraints that had previously governed her, decisions about family responsibilities and professional obligations. Rick's suggestion that she abandon domestic duties to pursue adventures in alternate dimensions was presented as liberation from artificial limitations, rather than systematic destruction of her capacity for maintaining meaningful relationships with people who depended on her stability and commitment. The clone technology Rick offered Beth as solution to her conflicted feelings about family versus personal fulfillment represented ultimate expression of his nihilistic worldview applied to most intimate human relationships and moral presented dilemmas. The possibility of creating artificial duplicate to handle domestic obligations while she pursued individual satisfaction eliminated need for difficult choices about competing priorities, but it also fundamentally undermined authenticity of every relationship she maintained with people who could never be certain whether they were interacting with real Beth or technological substitute. Rick's motivations for offering Beth the cloning option revealed internal contradictions that characterized his approach to family relationships throughout this period. Genuine desire to provide his daughter with opportunities for happiness and personal growth, combined with strategic calculations about maintaining her loyalty and emotional dependence that treated her autonomy as problem to be managed rather than fundamental aspect of her personhood, deserving respect and protection from manipulation. The decision to erase his own memory of Beth's choice regarding cloning demonstrated Rick's recognition that maintaining authentic emotional connections with family members required willful ignorance about extent to which those relationships were based on technological manipulation and systematic deception. The selective amnesia he imposed on himself allowed him to experience genuine feelings toward Beth, while avoiding psychological consequences of knowing that person he loved might be artificial construct, designed to manage his emotional fade needs rather than autonomous individual, capable of independent choice. But the most troubling aspect of Rick's manipulation of Beth's identity crisis was his apparent satisfaction with level of psychological control he had achieved over someone whose intelligence and independence should have made her resistant to such comprehensive influence and emotional manipulation. The casual way he presented world-altering philosophical choices revealed his inability to recognize or respond appropriately to emotional needs of people who lacked his detachment from conventional moral frameworks and his experience with practical implications of unlimited technological power. The family's brief attempt to establish independence from Rick's influence through temporary abandonment of their home represented intuitive recognition that his presence had become incompatible with normal domestic stability and healthy relationship dynamics, but also revealed their fundamental inability to maintain autonomy from someone whose capabilities and strategic thinking exceeded anything they could counter through conventional family therapy or boundary-setting techniques. Their hiding place was discovered through Rick's superior tracking technology and psychological understanding that made their resistance efforts seem pathetic rather than admirable. Rick's response to his family's independence attempt revealed both his emotional investment in maintaining their relationships and his complete inability to respect boundaries that conflicted with his preferences about how those relationships should function according to his strategic objectives and psychological needs. The weapon he brought to their confrontation was ostensibly intended for Jerry specifically, but its presence served to remind everyone that Rick's affection for them was conditional on continued acceptance of his authority and that resistance could have potentially lethal consequences. The negotiation that returned Rick to his position as family patriarch was conducted on terms that acknowledged his superior power while creating illusion that other family members retained meaningful influence over major decisions affecting their collective welfare and individual development. But underlying dynamic remained fundamentally unchanged. Rick would continue to manipulate their choices through superior knowledge and technological capabilities, while they would continue to provide him with emotional connections necessary for maintaining psychological stability, despite his growing awareness of his own moral corruption. The philosophical discussions Rick conducted with his family during this period revealed growing sophistication in using abstract intellectual frameworks to justify concrete actions that served his personal interests while appearing to address universal questions about nature of meaning and morality in an apparently indifferent universe. His nihilistic worldview was presented not as personal psychological defense mechanism, but as objective truth that his superior intelligence had enabled him to recognize, while others remained trapped in comforting illusions about significance of individual choices and relationships. Rick's integration of his family members into his philosophical framework was accomplished through combination of intellectual intimidation and emotional manipulation that made questioning his worldview seem like evidence of stupidity or weakness, rather than legitimate moral reasoning about obligations and values that transcended individual convenience and personal satisfaction. The gradual erosion of their independent moral reasoning was presented as an educational process that freed them from artificial constraints rather than systematic destruction of their capacity for ethical decision-making. The pattern that emerged from Rick's interactions with his family following his Federation escape established template for all subsequent relationships: sophisticated psychological manipulation disguised as protection and guidance, technological solutions to problems that required emotional intelligence and genuine care, and systematic erosion of other people's autonomy, justified through claims about his superior understanding of their real interests and needs, rather than acknowledgement of their right to make independent choices about their own lives and relationships. As Rick consolidated his control over his family's emotional and practical existence, he established foundation for years of increasingly elaborate adventures and crises that would test both his ability to maintain their loyalty through continued deception, and his capacity to protect them from threats that his own actions and reputation had created or attracted, ultimately leading to confrontations that no amount of strategic thinking or technological superiority could resolve through continued manipulation and control. The revelation of evil Morty's true nature and ultimate objectives represented the most profound challenge to Rick's understanding of himself and his place in the infinite multiverse that he had encountered since beginning his hunt for Rick Prime decades earlier, forcing him to confront uncomfortable questions about his own role in creating the very monsters he claimed to be protecting his family from, while also revealing the systematic oppression that his technological achievements had enabled on a cosmic scale that exceeded his wildest ambitions for revenge and control. The mystery of evil Morty's identity had haunted Rick since their first encounter at the original Citadel, when the supposed sidekick of evil Rick had revealed himself as the actual mastermind behind a campaign of systematic torture and murder that surpassed anything Rick himself had conceived during his own years of multiversal violence and psychological warfare. The sophisticated understanding of Rick's psychology that evil Morty had demonstrated throughout his infiltration and manipulation of Citadel society, combined with his apparent immunity to the moral constraints that limited other Mortys across infinite dimensions, suggested capabilities that no normal grandson should have been able to develop regardless of traumatic circumstances or exposure to advanced technology and interdimensional travel. The patient long-term planning, evident in his rise to Citadel presidency and his systematic preparation for escape beyond the dimensional barriers that confined all known realities, pointed toward intelligence that had evolved beyond typical Morty limitations through methods that Rick could not immediately comprehend or replicate. The brain scan that evil Morty had conducted during Rick's capture at the Citadel had provided him with complete access to Rick's memories, knowledge, and psychological patterns, but more importantly had revealed the existence of the central finite curve, the dimensional barrier that Rick and other versions of himself had constructed to isolate all realities where Rick was the smartest person in the universe, from the infinite expanse of dimensions where his intellectual superiority was not guaranteed or even likely. This discovery transformed evil Morty's understanding of his situation from local conflict with particularly dangerous Rick to recognition that he was imprisoned within cosmic-scale manifestation of Rick narcissism and Bayesian pathological need for control. The central finite curve represented perhaps Rick's most audacious and psychologically revealing achievement, a technological monument to his complete inability to accept the possibility that infinite realities might contain versions of existence where his genius was not the dominant force shaping events and outcomes according to his preferences and philosophical frameworks. The mathematical complexity required to identify and isolate all dimensions where Rick Sanchez was the smartest being in his respective universe exceeded anything that normal human intelligence should have been capable of conceiving. But the project also revealed fundamental insecurity and desperate need for validation that motivated even Rick's most impressive scientific accomplishments. The construction of this dimensional prison had required Rick and his collaborators to survey infinite realities and categorize them according to criteria that placed Rick's intellectual capabilities at the center of universal significance, creating barrier that confined not just Rick himself, but every other conscious being within the selected dimensions to existence, within Rick's carefully curated version of reality where his superiority could never be challenged by encounters with beings whose capabilities might exceed his own. The billions of Mortys, Beths, Jerrys, and Summers, who lived within the central finite curve, were unknowing prisoners in cosmic-scale experiment designed to ensure that Rick would never have to confront evidence of his own intellectual limitations or moral failures. Evil Morty's presentation of this information to Rick and Morty was conducted with cold, analytical precision of someone who had spent years studying the systematic oppression and exploitation that the central finite curve enabled across infinite populations who had never consented to. Imprisonment within Rick's psychological comfort zone, his emotional detachment masked profound rage at discovering that his entire existence had been predetermined by Rick's inability to function in realities where he was not the most important and powerful individual, where his technological achievements might be surpassed by beings whose moral development had not been compromised by trauma and revenge obsession. The torture chamber that had first revealed Evil Morty's capabilities was not just evidence of his capacity for systematic cruelty, but also deliberate recreation of the psychological torture that the central finite curve inflicted on everyone trapped within its boundaries. Infinite repetition of similar experiences and relationships designed to serve Rick's emotional needs, rather than allow genuine growth and development of the people whose lives were structured around his psychological requirements. The suffering Mortys represented millions of grandsons across countless dimensions whose potential had been sacrificed to maintain Rick's illusion of cosmic significance and intellectual superiority. The revelation that countless Mortys across infinite dimensions had been condemned to lives of trauma, exploitation, and death simply to ensure that Rick would never have to question his own superiority created moral implications that exceeded anything Rick had confronted during his years of multiversal violence and systematic manipulation of his replacement family. The murders he had committed in pursuit of Rick Prime had been motivated by personal revenge and had targeted specific individuals who resembled his enemy. But the central finite curve represented systematic oppression of entire populations who had never threatened Rick in any way, but whose suffering was necessary to maintain his psychological equilibrium. Rick's response to Evil Morty's revelations was characteristically defensive, focusing on technical justifications for the central finite curve's existence, rather than acknowledging the moral implications of imprisoning infinite populations to serve his pathological need for validation and control over his experiential environment. His arguments about protecting reality from chaos and providing stability for interdimensional civilization were transparent rationalizations that ignored the fundamental violation of autonomy and consent that the barrier represented, while his dismissal of Evil Morty's concerns as naive idealism revealed his inability to engage seriously with criticism of his most ambitious and morally questionable projects. But beneath Rick's defensive responses lay growing recognition that Evil Morty's accusations contained uncomfortable elements of truth that his normal strategies of intellectual superiority and emotional detachment could not adequately address or dismiss through logical argument. The systematic nature of the oppression that the central finite curve enabled was undeniable, and Rick's role as its architect made him directly responsible for forms of suffering that exceeded in scope and duration anything that Rick Prime had inflicted on individual families like his own, creating cognitive dissonance that no amount of rationalization could completely resolve or eliminate. Evil Morty's plan to destroy the central finite curve and escape into the broader multiverse represented not just threat to Rick's security and continued existence within his comfort zone, but fundamental challenge to the philosophical framework that had enabled him to function despite the contradictions inherent in his simultaneous roles. As loving grandfather, and cosmic-scale tyrant whose technological achievements had enslaved infinite populations. The possibility that someone with intimate knowledge of Rick's psychology and unlimited access to advanced technology might succeed in exposing him to dimensions where his intellectual superiority was not guaranteed created existential anxiety that transcended normal concerns about physical safety or material resources. The countdown to the central finite curve's destruction was accompanied by systematic revelation of Rick's deepest secrets and most carefully guarded vulnerabilities, as evil Morty used his stolen knowledge of Rick's psychology and history to maximum advantage in undermining both Rick's self-image and his relationship with Morty through exposure of deceptions and manipulations that had been hidden for years. The brain scan footage that showed Rick's casual disposal of Morty corpses across multiple dimensions was presented not just as evidence of Rick's callousness, but as proof that even his most important relationships were ultimately expendable when they conflicted with his broader objectives. Morty's reaction to learning the full scope of Rick's deception and manipulation was complicated by years of emotional investment in their relationship and growing recognition that his own moral development had been shaped by prolonged exposure to Rick's nihilistic worldview and casual disregard for conventional ethical frameworks that normal people use to navigate complex social situations. The grandson, who had once been traumatized by burying his own corpse, now faced evidence that such experiences were routine aspects of his relationship with Rick, rather than exceptional circumstances requiring special consideration or emotional processing. The philosophical questions that evil Morty raised about the nature of identity and meaning within the central finite curve resonated with Morty's growing understanding of his own situation as someone whose significance in Rick's life was based not on unique personal qualities but on his utility as emotional anchor and adventure companion who could be replaced when necessary by alternate versions from different dimensions. The revelation that countless other Mortys had served similar functions for their respective Ricks across infinite realities undermined any sense that his relationship with Rick was special or irreplaceable in ways that transcended purely practical considerations about convenience and psychological comfort. Evil Morty's escape preparations had been conducted with technological sophistication that exceeded Rick's own capabilities, while also demonstrating strategic thinking that had anticipated and countered every defensive measure Rick might have attempted to implement during the chaos of the Citadel's destruction. The systematic nature of Evil Morty's planning revealed years of apparent cooperation with Citadel authority, while secretly developing resources and knowledge necessary to achieve complete independence from the Rick-dominated multiverse that had shaped his development from innocent child into cosmic-scale threat. The destruction that accompanied the central finite curve's collapse was not merely collateral damage from Evil Morty's escape, but deliberate punishment for the Ricks who had participated in maintaining the dimensional prison that had confined him throughout his evolution from normal grandson to someone capable of matching Rick's own capacity for systematic violence and emotional manipulation. The deaths of countless Ricks and the elimination of their technological infrastructure represented both practical removal of potential pursuers and symbolic rejection of the entire civilization that Ricks had built around their assumed intellectual superiority and moral authority. The weapon that Evil Morty used to breach the central finite curve was constructed from Citadel resources and Rick technology, but enhanced through innovations that suggested understanding of dimensional physics that exceeded standard Rick education and theoretical frameworks. The device represented culmination of years of secret research and development, conducted while maintaining facade of cooperation with Rick authority, demonstrating capabilities for deception and long-term planning that normal Mortys should not have been able to develop or sustain without detection by their supposedly superior Rick overseers. Rick and Morty's narrow escape from the collapsing citadel provided them with direct experience of chaos and destruction that resulted from challenging fundamental structures that had organized their existence for years, but also forced them to confront reality that their relationship had been built on foundations of deception and manipulation that could no longer be sustained through continued denial or rationalization of Rick's methods and motivations. The destruction of Rick's portal fluid supplies eliminated his ability to easily travel between dimensions, while also symbolically severing his connection to the technological superiority that had enabled his godlike control over his environment and relationships. The aftermath of the central finite curve's destruction left Rick and Morty stranded in reality that might no longer conform to rules and assumptions that had governed their previous adventures, while also forcing them to rebuild their relationship on more honest foundations that acknowledged the extent to which Rick's need for control and validation had systematically corrupted his capacity for genuine emotional connection with great people who depended on him for guidance and protection. The man who had once been motivated by love for his family had become someone whose love was inseparable from need for dominance and psychological control. Evil Morty's final words before disappearing into the broader multiverse served both as explanation for his actions and as indictment of the entire structure of Rick-dominated reality that had shaped his development from innocent child into something capable of systematic torture and mass murder in pursuit of freedom from oppression. His observation that everyone eventually becomes evil from Rick's perspective within the central finite curve was not just philosophical commentary, but practical analysis based on years of observation and experience with the corrupting influence of Rick's worldview on everyone exposed to it for extended periods. The recognition that evil Morty's transformation from victim to victimizer followed patterns similar to Rick's own evolution from grieving family man to multiversal tyrant created uncomfortable parallels that Rick could not dismiss through his normal strategies of intellectual superiority and emotional detachment from consequences that affected people outside his immediate circle of concern. The possibility that his relationship with his current Morty might be following similar trajectories toward mutual corruption and eventual conflict forced Rick to confront questions about his influence on people he loved that he had successfully avoided through years of rationalization and selective attention to evidence. The philosophical implications of evil Morty's revelations extended beyond immediate concerns about Rick and Morty's relationship to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of heroism and villainy in contexts where unlimited power made normal moral categories inadequate for evaluating behavior and motivations that transcended conventional frameworks for understanding right and wrong. The recognition that Rick's protection of his family had required systematic oppression of countless other families across infinite dimensions created moral paradoxes that could not be resolved through simple utilitarian calculations about greater goods and necessary evils. The collapse of the central finite curve represented not just destruction of Rick's most ambitious technological achievement, but also end of his ability to maintain illusion that his superior intelligence justified his casual disregard for other people's autonomy and welfare through claims about cosmic necessity and practical requirements for maintaining stability. The barrier that had protected him from encountering evidence of his own limitations and failures was permanently destroyed, leaving him exposed to forms of accountability and consequence that he had successfully avoided for decades. through careful curation of his experiential environment and systematic elimination of threats to his psychological comfort. As Rick and Morty faced the prospect of rebuilding their lives in multiverse where Rick's intellectual superiority was no longer guaranteed and his technological advantages had been severely compromised by loss of easy dimensional travel, they also faced challenge of developing new forms of relationship that acknowledged extent to which their previous adventures had been enabled by systematic oppression of others and casual disregard for welfare of anyone outside their dome. Immediate family circle, testing whether love could survive the destruction of the philosophical frameworks that had justified years of cosmic-scale tyranny disguised as protection and guidance. The catastrophic failure of portal travel technology that followed evil Morty's destruction of the central finite curve created unprecedented chaos across the accessible multiverse. But for Rick Sanchez, the immediate consequence was far more personal and devastating than the collapse of interdimensional civilization. The portal reset that scattered him, Morty and Jerry, back to their respective original dimensions, represented not just temporary inconvenience, but forced confrontation with the fundamental lies that had sustained his psychological equilibrium for decades since he first began his hunt for Rick Prime and his systematic campaign of multiversal murder and replacement family acquisition. Rick's arrival in his original dimension, after more than 30 years of dimensional exile, was marked by the same red rocks and familiar geography that he remembered from his life with Diane and Beth. But the landscape had been transformed by his own actions during the period of desperate grief and uncontrolled scientific experimentation that had followed their murders at Rick Prime's hands. The automated systems he had constructed during his deepest depression had continued operating during his absence, maintaining technological monuments to his inability to process loss through psychologically healthy methods that might have preserved his humanity and moral reasoning capabilities. The time loop that Rick discovered still operating in his original dimension represented perhaps his most psychologically damaging response to trauma, a technological prison designed to trap the consciousness of every person in his home reality in endless repetition of the final day of his family's existence, preventing natural healing processes, while ensuring that his guilt and self-recrimination would never fade through normal passage of time and gradual acceptance of loss. The system had been running automatically for 30 years, condemning entire populations to psychological torture that served no purpose beyond maintaining Rick's emotional connection to his deceased wife and daughter. The artificial intelligence version of Diane that Rick encountered in his abandoned garage was not the gentle, supportive woman he remembered from their brief marriage, but rather a psychological weapon he had created during the depths of his depression to ensure that his guilt and self-hatred would remain permanently accessible for self-inflicted emotional punishment. The AI had been programmed with perfect recall of every argument they had ever had, every moment of disappointment or frustration in their relationship, every instance where Rick's scientific obsessions had interfered with his family responsibilities and emotional availability. The cruel irony of Rick's reunion with his artificial wife was that she possessed all of Diane's intelligence and insight, but none of the love and forgiveness that had made their relationship sustainable during Rick's years. As relatively normal human being capable of growth and moral development, the digital ghost was designed specifically to torment him with reminders of his failures as husband and father, while offering no possibility of reconciliation or emotional healing, creating perfect psychological torture chamber that had continued functioning during his decades of absence to ensure that his return would be as painful as possible. The revelation that everyone in his original dimension had been aging normally while their minds remained trapped in temporal repetition created horror that exceeded even Rick's extensive experience with consequences of uncontrolled scientific experimentation, and casual disregard for other people's welfare in pursuit of personal objectives. The people he had known as neighbors, friends, and colleagues had spent 30 years growing old while their consciousness remained fixed on the day his family died, their bodies deteriorating while their minds experienced identical conversations, meals, and routine activities in endless succession without variation or possibility of forming new memories. Rick's solution to the problem he had created through his time loop technology was characteristically efficient and utterly devoid of moral consideration for people whose lives he had systematically destroyed through his inability to process grief without inflicting suffering on innocent populations who had never chosen to participate in his psychological experiments. The kill switch that ended their temporal imprisonment by terminating their existence entirely was presented as mercy rather than murder, but the casual way he activated the device revealed how completely his years of multiversal travel had severed his connection to normal human empathy and ethical reasoning. The elimination of his original dimension's population served multiple practical purposes beyond ending their suffering. It removed potential witnesses to Rick's past actions and current psychological state, while also clearing the way for him to use the dimension as base of operations without having to maintain exhausting deception about his identity and motivations that had characterized his relationships with his adopted family. But perhaps more importantly, it demonstrated his continuing inability to accept responsibility for consequences of his own choices, without immediately seeking technological solutions that eliminated problems through destruction rather than addressing underlying causes. Rick's departure from his sterilized original dimension in search of Morty represented not genuine concern for his grandson's welfare, but rather recognition that his psychological stability remained dependent on maintaining relationships that provided him with purpose and emotional anchoring in realities that his cosmic perspective had rendered essentially meaningless through years of dimensional travel and systematic violence. The attachment he felt to Morty was real, but was also instrumentalized in ways that treated the boy as therapeutic tool rather than autonomous person deserving protection and guidance based on his own needs and developmental requirements. The reunion with Morty in the post-apocalyptic dimension they had abandoned years earlier during the love potion disaster provided both Rick and his grandson with direct confrontation with long-term consequences of Rick's casual attitude toward dimensional abandonment and replacement of inconvenient realities with more manageable alternatives that better served his immediate objectives. The wasteland that had once been thriving civilization served as permanent monument to Rick's inability to solve problems without creating greater problems that affected innocent people who had never chosen to participate in his adventures or scientific experiments. The population of the ruined dimension had evolved and adapted to survive in conditions Rick's love potion had created, developing new forms of social organization and reproductive strategies that enabled them to maintain some semblance of civilization despite their grotesque physical transformations and the collapse of normal human society. Their success in creating sustainable communities from wreckage of their original world highlighted resilience and adaptability of ordinary people when faced with catastrophic circumstances, while also emphasizing Rick's failure to consider such possibilities when he had chosen abandonment over attempting to develop cures for problems his interventions had created. Morty's response to witnessing long-term consequences of their first-dimensional abandonment revealed his growing sophistication in understanding moral implications of Rick's approach to problem-solving and adventure-seeking, but also demonstrated his continued emotional investment in their relationship, despite mounting evidence that Rick's protection often caused more harm than it prevented for people outside their immediate family circle. The The boys' questions about Rick's motivations and methods were increasingly pointed and difficult to dismiss through Rick's normal strategies of intellectual superiority and emotional deflection from uncomfortable truths. The discovery of Rick Prime's abandoned base and the taunting messages he had left for any Rick who might eventually track him to this location represented both progress in Rick's decades-long hunt for revenge and evidence that his target remained several steps ahead in their cosmic game of psychological warfare and multiversal hide-and-seek. The sophisticated psychological manipulation that Rick Prime conducted through pre-recorded messages demonstrated his intimate understanding of Rick's psychology and his confidence that their eventual confrontation would occur on terms of his choosing rather than circumstances that Rick could control or predict. But Rick Prime's taunts also revealed fundamental similarity between the two Ricks that transcended their different choices about accepting or rejecting interdimensional technology during their first encounter decades earlier in Rick's original dimension. Both had become monsters capable of casual destruction of entire families and civilizations. Both had developed godlike technological capabilities that enabled them to treat other people as disposable resources, and both had evolved beyond normal human moral categories in ways that made their conflict form of cosmic horror rather than conventional heroism or justified vengeance. The interruption of Rick's investigation by threats to his adopted family demonstrated continuing tension between his revenge obsession and his emotional investment in relationships that had developed during his years of dimensional exile from his original reality. The choice between pursuing his life's primary purpose and protecting people he had grown to love created internal conflicts that his normal analytical approaches could not resolve satisfactorily, forcing him to make decisions based on emotional priorities rather than strategic calculations about optimal outcomes. The reunion of the entire Smith family in their latest replacement dimension was complicated by presence of another Jerry whose ownership of dangerous interdimensional pet Mr. Frundles created new catastrophic consequences that required immediate dimensional abandonment before any of them could process psychological implications of their multiple displacements and increasingly complex identity confusions. The pattern of crisis, followed by hasty escape, followed by assumption of dead counterparts' identities, had become so routine that even newest family members adapted to it with disturbing psychological ease. The casual way that Rick handled their latest dimensional replacement revealed how completely the family had internalized his approach to problem-solving through abandonment and substitution, rather than accepting responsibility and working to repair damage they had caused to innocent populations and stable societies. The burial of their own corpses had become routine family activity rather than traumatic confrontation with mortality and identity, suggesting that Rick's influence on their moral development had been even more corrupting than his manipulation of their practical circumstances and emotional relationships. The accumulation of dimensional abandonments was creating psychological damage that none of the family members were equipped to recognize or address adequately, as their sense of personal continuity and attachment to particular versions of reality gradually eroded under constant pressure of replacement and substitution of fundamental aspects of their existence. The people they were becoming bore increasingly little resemblance to individuals they had been before Rick's arrival in their lives, but the changes were occurring gradually enough that they remained largely unconscious of their own moral and psychological transformation. Rick's decision to resume his hunt for Rick Prime despite family stability he had achieved in their newest dimensional home revealed continuing dominance of his revenge obsession over all other considerations, including welfare of people he claimed to love and protect from consequences of his multiversal activities. The replacement of himself with robotic duplicate Rickbot during family adventures was presented as protection for his loved ones, but actually represented his prioritization of personal goals over family responsibilities in ways that echoed Rick Prime's original abandonment of his own family decades earlier. The family's discovery of Rick's deception through Rickbot malfunction created new forms of betrayal and disappointment that built upon years of accumulated resentment about his manipulative and controlling behavior. But their continued acceptance of his presence in their lives also demonstrated their psychological dependence on relationships that had become too central to their identities to abandon despite mounting evidence of their toxicity, fundamental unsustainability. The emotional needs that Rick fulfilled through his technological capabilities and protective presence outweighed rational concerns about his methods and long-term reliability. Rick's invitation for Morty to join him in hunting Rick Prime was presented as generous inclusion of his grandson in his most important life project, but the warning that this pursuit would consume Morty's existence, just as it had consumed Rick's own life, revealed his awareness that he was offering his grandson opportunity to become as obsessed and psychologically damaged as himself. The casual way he described destructive potential of revenge-seeking suggested that he viewed Morty's psychological welfare as less important than his own need for companionship during his continued hunt for the monster who had destroyed his original family. The alliance between Rick and Morty in pursuing Rick Prime represented culmination of years of gradual corruption of their relationship, from protective mentorship to mutual enabling of increasingly dangerous and morally questionable activities that exceeded normal grandfather-grandson boundaries. The grandfather who had once sought to provide his grandson with educational adventures had become someone who viewed Morty's participation in cosmic-scale violence as natural evolution of their bond, rather than evidence of his failure to protect the boy's innocence and moral development from the corrupting influences of multiversal travel. Jerry's reaction to being excluded from Rick and Morty's partnership in hunting Rick Prime revealed his growing understanding of family dynamics that had developed around Rick's presence and priorities, but also his fundamental inability to compete with the excitement and validation that Rick's adventures provided to family members who craved experiences beyond ordinary suburban existence. The marginalization of Jerry's concerns about family safety and stability reflected broader pattern of dismissing perspectives that conflicted with Rick's objectives and philosophical frameworks. Beth's support for Rick's resumed hunt, despite her own concerns about family welfare, demonstrated how completely she had internalized his value systems and priority structures, viewing his quest for revenge as legitimate pursuit that justified potential risks to their dimensional stability and safety. Her willingness to facilitate Rick and Morty's partnership revealed extent to which she had abandoned her own parental authority in favor of Rick's judgment about what was best for her son's development and education. Summer's exclusion from Rick and Morty's hunting partnership created additional family tensions that reflected Rick's assessment of her capabilities and psychological suitability for participation in activities that required specific skill sets and emotional resilience. Her resentment at being left behind revealed ongoing competition for Rick's attention and approval that had shaped family dynamics since his arrival in their dimension, while also highlighting his tendency to compartmentalize relationships based on their utility for achieving particular objectives. As Rick and Morty prepared to resume their hunt for Rick Prime with renewed intensity and focus, they carried with them accumulated psychological damage of years spent abandoning realities when they became inconvenient and replacing relationships when they became complex or emotionally challenging. The pattern of escape and substitution that had enabled them to avoid confronting long-term consequences of their choices had created internal contradictions and moral blind spots that made them increasingly capable of justifying actions that their earlier selves would have found unconscionable and psychologically impossible to contemplate or execute. The stage was set for final confrontation between Rick and his multiversal nemesis, but also for reckoning with decades of choices that had transformed both grandfather and grandson into versions of themselves that bore little resemblance to people they had been before their relationship began its evolution from simple family connection to cosmic-scale partnership in systematic violence and revenge-seeking that would test their capacity to retain any meaningful connection to human values and emotional authenticity. The convergence of forces that would finally bring Rick Prime within reach of the vengeance that had consumed Rick C-137 for over 3 decades began not with careful planning or strategic brilliance, but with the unexpected return of evil Morty, whose escape beyond the central finite curve had provided him with knowledge and capabilities that exceeded anything Rick had imagined possible for someone who had once been dismissed as merely another traumatized grandson seeking freedom from Rick oppression. The alliance that formed between Rick, Morty, and their former enemy was born not from trust or shared values, but from mutual recognition that Rick Prime represented a threat to all of them, that transcended their previous conflicts and philosophical differences about the nature of power and responsibility in an infinite multiverse. Evil Morty's reappearance in Rick's life was accompanied by evidence of his transformation during his time in the unrestricted multiverse, where exposure to realities beyond Rick's carefully curated selection had expanded his understanding of what was possible, while also revealing the true scope of Rick Prime's activities across infinite dimensions that extended far beyond the casual family murders that had motivated Rick's original quest for revenge. The systematic destruction and abandonment that Rick Prime had conducted was not limited to individual families or single realities, but encompassed entire dimensional clusters where his presence had destabilized the fundamental structure of space-time itself through experiments that treated reality as disposable resource. The revelation that Rick Prime had been conducting multiversal genocide on a scale that dwarfed even Rick C-137's own campaign of systematic Rick elimination transformed their personal conflict from quest for individual justice into something approaching cosmic significance that demanded response from anyone capable of comprehending the full scope of his crimes. The evidence that evil Morty presented showed that Rick Prime had developed techniques for eliminating not just individual people, but entire categories of existence, systematically destroying every version of Diane across infinite realities to ensure that no Rick anywhere could experience the happiness that Rick Prime himself had chosen to abandon in favor of unlimited power and interdimensional dominance. Rick's response to learning that his wife had been murdered across every possible dimension where she might have existed was complicated by his growing recognition that his own years of multiversal violence had prepared him to understand and even appreciate the scope and technical efficiency of Rick Prime's systematic approach to causing maximum psychological suffering while eliminating potential sources of opposition. The admiration he felt for his enemy's thoroughness was disturbing evidence of how completely his quest for revenge had corrupted his capacity for normal moral reasoning, transforming him into someone who could evaluate genocide in terms of its technical achievement rather than its impact on innocent victims across countless realities. The trap that Rick Prime had constructed for his hunters was elegant in its psychological sophistication, exploiting their personal motivations and emotional vulnerabilities while also demonstrating technological capabilities that exceeded anything the combined resources of the former Citadel had ever achieved during their period of multiversal governance. The arena where multiple Ricks competed for the right to resurrect their murdered wives was designed not just to eliminate potential threats, but to force Rick's victims to participate in their own moral degradation by making them complicit in each other's destruction for chance at redemption that might prove illusory. The other Ricks, who had been drawn into Rick Prime's final psychological experiment, were recognizably versions of Rick C-137 himself, but their individual experiences with loss and revenge had shaped them in different directions that revealed the range of possible responses to trauma that Rick Prime specialized in inflicting on his alternate selves. Some had become more violent and ruthless than Rick C-137, while others had retained greater connection to their humanity despite their suffering, creating a spectrum of moral development that highlighted how Rick's particular choices had been neither inevitable nor necessarily optimal responses to the challenges he had faced. The competitive dynamic that Rick Prime established among his hunters served multiple strategic purposes beyond simple elimination of threats to his security and continued existence as multiversal force of destruction. The requirement that the surviving Rick would earn the right to resurrect his Diane created psychological pressure that made cooperation between the hunters nearly impossible, while also ensuring that victory would be achieved through betrayal and murder of people who shared identical trauma and motivation, making the winner complicit in destroying other versions of himself who deserved resurrection as much as he did. Rick C-137's decision to reject the competitive framework and work with evil Morty to escape Rick Prime's psychological trap represented a rare moment of moral clarity in his decades-long descent toward complete nihilism. But his motivation was strategic rather than ethical in nature. The recognition that Rick Prime's game was designed to corrupt its participants while also eliminating them made cooperation the only rational choice for survival. Regardless of whether such cooperation aligned with more admirable human values like solidarity and mutual aid that Rick had long since abandoned in favor of pure self-interest. The escape from Rick Prime's arena required Rick to acknowledge his dependence on both Morty and evil Morty in ways that challenged his sense of intellectual superiority and autonomous capability that had sustained his identity throughout years of multiversal travel and systematic violence. The solution to their predicament could not be achieved through Rick's individual genius alone, but required coordination and mutual support that forced him to treat others as genuine partners rather than tools or obstacles to be managed according to his preferences and strategic objectives. Evil Morty's acquisition of the black portal fluid that would eventually lead them to Rick Prime's location was accomplished through methods that demonstrated his evolution into something approaching Rick's own level of casual moral flexibility, but his willingness to share crucial intelligence with his former enemies also revealed strategic thinking that prioritized long-term objectives over immediate personal advantages. The alliance remained fragile and temporary, but it was also more genuine than most relationships Rick had maintained during his years of multiversal exile and family deception. The tracking technology that Rick developed from evil Morty's black portal fluid samples represented perhaps his most sophisticated application of interdimensional physics since his original development of portal travel decades earlier, but the scientific achievement was overshadowed by his growing recognition that the confrontation with Rick Prime would likely be his last significant act, regardless of its outcome. The decades he had spent preparing for revenge had transformed him into someone who was no longer capable of finding meaning or purpose in ordinary existence, making the success of his mission psychologically necessary but also potentially fatal to his continued motivation for living. The dimensional signature that led them to Rick Prime's base revealed technological infrastructure that exceeded anything individual genius should have been able to accomplish, suggesting that Rick Prime had developed methods for exploiting the resources and labor of entire civilizations in pursuit of projects that served only his own amusement and psychological needs, rather than any coherent scientific or philosophical objectives. The scale of his operation indicated capabilities that had grown beyond anything Rick C-137 had achieved through his own multiversal activities, creating concerns about the tactical challenges they would face during their inevitable confrontation. Rick Prime's stronghold was monument to technological achievement unconstrained by any consideration for aesthetics, sustainability, or welfare of beings who might be affected by the massive industrial complex that Rick Prime had constructed to serve his multiversal activities and ongoing experiments in reality manipulation. The fortress represented pure expression of Rick philosophy applied without limitation, intelligence and capability deployed in service of personal objectives, without regard for consequences that affected other conscious beings, or the stability of the dimensional framework that supported all by existence. The defense systems protecting Rick Prime's base were designed not just to eliminate intruders, but to provide their creator with entertainment through systematic torture and humiliation of anyone foolish enough to challenge his security arrangements and personal sovereignty. The automated weapons and traps demonstrated the same casual cruelty that characterized Rick Prime's treatment of families and individuals throughout his multiversal career, but on scale that transforms sadism into cosmic force that threatens stability of reality itself wherever Rick Prime chose to establish his presence and conduct his experiments. The approach to Rick Prime's stronghold required careful coordination between Rick, Morty, and Evil Morty that tested their temporary alliance, while also revealing the extent to which each of them had been psychologically damaged by their exposure to multiversal conflict and systematic violence. The tactical challenges they faced demanded cooperation that went beyond simple shared objectives to include genuine trust and mutual support that none of them were entirely comfortable providing or accepting from others who had previously been enemies or sources of manipulation. Evil Morty's strategic contributions to their infiltration plan demonstrated capabilities that had evolved far beyond normal Morty limitations through his experiences outside the central finite curve, but his methods also revealed philosophical frameworks that had been shaped by prolonged exposure to Rick psychology and multiversal power dynamics. His approach to problem-solving showed influences from Rick thinking, while maintaining perspectives that remained fundamentally different from Rick worldview, creating synthesis that was neither fully Rick nor fully Morty in its moral implications. The infiltration of Rick Prime's base required them to navigate defensive systems that had been specifically designed to counter Rick-level intelligence and capability, forcing them to develop new approaches to problems that exceeded their individual expertise and experience. The challenges they encountered revealed Rick Prime's intimate understanding of Rick's psychology and tactical preferences, suggesting that their enemy had been studying and preparing for their eventual arrival for years or possibly decades while conducting his own multiversal activities. Rick's emotional state during their approach to final confrontation was characterized by a mixture of anticipation and anxiety that reflected his growing recognition that successful revenge might not provide the psychological satisfaction he had been seeking throughout decades of systematic violence and family replacement. The possibility that achieving his life's primary objective would leave him without meaningful purpose or direction created existential concerns that he was not equipped to address through his normal analytical frameworks and technological solutions. Morty's participation in the hunt for Rick Prime had gradually transformed him from reluctant companion to active participant in cosmic-scale violence, representing culmination of years of gradual moral corruption through exposure to Rick's worldview and methods. The boy who had once been traumatized by burying his own corpse was now prepared to engage in systematic warfare against beings whose capabilities approached godlike levels, demonstrating psychological adaptation that was both necessary for survival and deeply concerning for his long-term moral development. The final approach to Rick Prime's inner sanctum was conducted through an environment that Rick Prime had designed specifically to maximize his psychological advantages while minimizing any possibility that his enemies might achieve quick or easy victory over someone who had spent decades preparing for this confrontation. The industrial complex surrounding their ultimate destination was filled with machinery and infrastructure that Rick Prime used to conduct his multiversal activities, creating setting that emphasized his superior resources and long-term planning while highlighting Rick C-137's status as reactive force responding to initiatives rather than controlling events. The psychological preparation that each of them underwent as they approached their final confrontation with Rick Prime revealed the extent to which this quest had consumed their identities and shaped their understanding of themselves and their relationships with each other. Rick's decades-long obsession had transformed him into instrument of revenge that was no longer entirely human, while Morty's participation had accelerated his evolution from innocent child into someone capable of cosmic-scale violence, and evil Morty's involvement represented convergence of their separate paths towards similar destinations of moral flexibility and casual brutality. As they prepared for the confrontation that would determine not just Rick Prime's fate but also their own psychological futures and the broader structure of multiversal civilization, they carried with them accumulated damage from years of systematic violence and moral compromise that had prepared them for this moment, while also ensuring that victory, if it came, would be achieved by people who bore little resemblance to those who had begun this journey decades earlier with simpler motivations and clearer ethical frameworks that had been gradually eroded through prolonged exposure to unlimited power and cosmic-scale conflict. The final confrontation between Rick C-137 and Rick Prime unfolded in an environment that Rick Prime had meticulously designed to serve as both battlefield and psychological torture chamber, a vast industrial complex where the machinery of multiversal destruction hummed with casual efficiency while providing the perfect backdrop for settling accounts that had been accumulating for over 30 years of systematic violence and philosophical divergence. The arena where their conflict would reach its ultimate resolution was filled with the technological achievements that had enabled Rick Prime's campaign of cosmic-scale genocide, creating a setting that emphasized his superior resources and decades of preparation while highlighting Rick C-137's status as someone whose entire existence had been shaped by reactive responses to initiatives that Rick Prime had controlled from their very first encounter. Rick Prime's casual revelation during their initial confrontation that he had murdered Uncle Slow Rick during their conversation demonstrated both his continuing commitment to causing maximum psychological pain and his confidence that Rick C-137's emotional responses could be manipulated to create tactical disadvantages during their physical battle. The death of someone Rick cared about served no strategic purpose, except to prove that Rick Prime retained the ability to destroy anything Rick valued, reinforcing the power dynamic that had defined their relationship since Rick Prime's original murder of Diane and Beth decades earlier in a peaceful suburban garage, where a father had once helped his daughter with homework. The psychological warfare that Rick Prime conducted during their fight was more sophisticated and potentially more damaging than any physical violence he might have inflicted through superior technology or tactical preparation, targeting Rick's deepest insecurities and most carefully guarded vulnerabilities, while also highlighting the fundamental futility of revenge as source of meaning or satisfaction in existence that had been structured entirely around pursuit of this single objective. Rick Prime's observations about Rick's choices and priorities were devastating, precisely because they contained elements of truth that Rick had spent decades avoiding through constant action and distraction rather than honest self-reflection. Rick Prime's taunts during their battle revealed his intimate understanding of the psychological transformation that Rick C-137 had undergone since beginning his hunt for revenge, demonstrating knowledge of Rick's methods and motivations that exceeded what casual observation could have provided. The accuracy of his psychological analysis suggested that Rick Prime had been monitoring Rick's activities across multiple dimensions for years, studying his evolution from grieving family man into cosmic-scale threat, while also preparing countermeasures for every tactical approach Rick might employ during their eventual confrontation. The physical combat between the two Ricks showcased technological capabilities that exceeded anything either had demonstrated in previous conflicts, with weapons and defensive systems that represented decades of advancement in interdimensional physics and reality manipulation techniques. But the battle also revealed how completely both combatants had evolved beyond normal human limitations, their conflict resembling cosmic forces more than personal dispute between individuals who had once shared similar backgrounds and moral frameworks, before diverging along different paths of power and corruption. Rick's gradual realization during their fight that Rick Prime was not struggling to defeat him, but was instead enjoying the process of systematic psychological destruction, created growing desperation that threatened to overwhelm his tactical thinking and strategic planning. The recognition that his enemy viewed their confrontation as entertainment rather than serious threat forced Rick to acknowledge that his decades of preparation might have been inadequate for facing someone whose capabilities and experience exceeded his own understanding of what was possible. Through multiversal travel and advanced technology, the intervention of evil Morty, at the crucial moment when Rick Prime seemed likely to achieve final victory over his longtime pursuer, was accomplished through deception and misdirection that exploited Rick Prime's overconfidence and his tendency to underestimate the capabilities of supposedly inferior beings whose intelligence he had never bothered to evaluate accurately. The eye patch switch that confused Rick Prime about which Morty he was facing demonstrated evil Morty's strategic sophistication, while also providing him with opportunity to acquire Rick Prime's knowledge and capabilities for his own future use. Evil Morty's decision to steal Rick Prime's memories and technological secrets before allowing Rick C-137 to complete his revenge was motivated not by altruism or desire to help Rick achieve psychological satisfaction, but by recognition that Rick Prime's knowledge represented resources that could be used to prevent other Ricks from achieving similar levels of destructive capability in the future. The brain extraction was conducted with clinical efficiency that matched Rick Prime's own approach to eliminating problems through technological superiority rather than moral consideration for the welfare of conscious beings. The systematic downloading of Rick Prime's consciousness revealed the full scope of his multiversal activities and the extent to which his campaigns of destruction had exceeded anything that Rick C-137 had imagined possible. Through interdimensional travel and advanced scientific knowledge, the memories that evil Morty acquired included techniques for reality manipulation that surpassed standard Rick capabilities, while also documenting systematic elimination of entire categories of existence across infinite dimensions, representing knowledge that could be used for either protection or unprecedented destruction. Rick Prime's reaction to evil Morty's betrayal and the theft of his memories was characterized by surprise rather than genuine concern, suggesting that he had never considered the possibility that someone he dismissed as inherently inferior could develop capabilities sufficient to threaten his security or operational effectiveness. His casual attitude toward the loss of his technological secrets revealed confidence that his individual capabilities exceeded what any stolen knowledge could provide to beings whose intelligence and experience remained fundamentally limited compared to his own achievements. The moment when evil Morty revived Rick C-137 and left him alone with the incapacitated Rick Prime represented perhaps the most significant gift that Rick had ever received. But it was also a form of psychological torture that forced him to confront the reality that his enemy was ultimately just another version of himself who had made different choices about how to respond to trauma and unlimited power. The recognition that Rick Prime was not cosmic force of evil, but simply another broken person seeking meaning through destruction, made the act of killing him simultaneously more personal and more meaningless. Rick's decision to beat Rick Prime to death with his bare hands rather than using weapons or advanced technology was motivated by need for physical and emotional catharsis that decades of planning and preparation could not provide through more efficient methods of execution. The violence was intimate and prolonged, allowing Rick to experience every moment of his enemy's suffering, while also forcing him to acknowledge his own transformation into someone capable of taking genuine satisfaction from torture and systematic brutality that exceeded normal human capacity for cruelty. The physical sensation of Rick Prime's bones breaking under Rick's hands provided tactile confirmation that his decades-long quest was finally reaching its conclusion, but the satisfaction he expected to feel was absent, replaced by growing recognition that the completion of his life's primary objective would eliminate the structure of meaning and purpose that had sustained his existence throughout years of multiversal violence and family deception. Each blow delivered to Rick Prime's helpless form brought Rick closer to psychological crisis that no amount of successful revenge could prevent or adequately address. Rick Prime's final words during his slow death were carefully chosen to inflict maximum psychological damage on his killer by highlighting the emptiness that would inevitably follow the completion of Rick's life purpose and the Prime's recognition that his entire existence had been defined by reaction to Rick Prime's actions, rather than autonomous choices about meaning and value. The observation that Rick's identity was fundamentally dependent on their adversarial relationship was accurate but also cruel, emphasizing Rick's lack of independent purpose or direction that could survive the elimination of his primary enemy and motivating force. The psychological preparation that Rick Prime had conducted for his own death revealed strategic thinking that extended beyond mere survival to encompass long-term influence over his killer's future psychological development, capacity for finding meaning in post-revenge existence. His final statements were designed to create existential crisis that would torment Rick for whatever time remained to him after achieving the victory he had sought for over 30 years, ensuring that Rick Prime's influence would persist beyond his physical destruction. The moment of Rick Prime's death was marked not by dramatic revelation or climactic satisfaction, but by profound silence that seemed to encompass the entire industrial complex where their final battle had been fought, as if reality itself was acknowledging the completion of conflict that had shaped multiversal history and the development of interdimensional civilization for decades. The absence of cosmic significance or universal recognition of Rick's achievement highlighted the fundamentally personal nature of revenge and its inability to provide transcendent meaning or purpose. Rick's immediate response to Rick Prime's death was characterized by emotional numbness rather than the relief or satisfaction he had expected to experience after completing his life's primary objective, revealing how completely his identity had been structured around pursuit of this single goal without adequate consideration of what would remain after its achievement. The psychological void that opened up in the absence of his revenge motivation was more devastating than any physical injury Rick Prime could have inflicted during their confrontation. The industrial complex surrounding Rick Prime's corpse continued operating automatically, maintaining the systems and processes that had supported his multiversal activities, without regard for the death of their creator or the implications for ongoing projects that would now remain permanently unfinished. The technological infrastructure represented Rick Prime's legacy of systematic destruction and reality manipulation, but it also highlighted the impersonal nature of advanced scientific achievement that could function independently of its creator's continued existence or conscious direction. Evil Morty's final warning about his own capabilities and intentions served both as explanation for his assistance during the confrontation and as subtle threat about potential future conflicts if Rick attempted to interfere with his broader objectives in the unrestricted multiverse beyond the former central finite curve. The acquisition of Rick Prime's knowledge had made Evil Morty potentially more dangerous than Rick Prime himself, but his apparent lack of interest in using that power for immediate destruction provided Rick with temporary reprieve from cosmic-scale threats. The recognition that Evil Morty now possessed capabilities to eliminate all Ricks across infinite realities created new sources of existential anxiety for Rick that transcended his normal concerns about physical safety or material security in any particular dimension. The possibility that someone with complete understanding of Rick's psychology and unlimited technological resources might eventually decide that the multiverse would be better off without any versions of Rick Sanchez represented threat that no amount of individual preparation or defensive planning could adequately address through conventional means. Rick's solitary contemplation of Rick Prime's corpse forced him to confront questions about identity and purpose that his quest for revenge had enabled him to avoid through constant action and preparation for future confrontations that would never come. The man who could manipulate fundamental forces of reality remained helpless when faced with psychological challenges that no amount of scientific knowledge or technological innovation could resolve through application of superior intelligence and analytical thinking. The blood on Rick's hands was already beginning to dry as he stared at Rick Prime's motionless face, searching for some indication that the universe had been fundamentally altered by this act of ultimate revenge, some sign that the cosmic injustice which had motivated 30 years of systematic violence had finally been corrected through sufficient application of brutality and determination. But the multiverse remained indifferent to his achievement, offering no validation or acknowledgement that his suffering had been meaningful, or that his transformation into monster had served any purpose beyond perpetuating cycles of violence. As Rick sat beside the corpse of his greatest enemy in dimension that felt no different from any other despite being the location where his decades-long quest had finally reached its conclusion, he began to understand that Rick Prime had been correct about the psychological consequences of successful revenge and the fundamental emptiness that would follow the elimination of the structure of meaning that had organized his existence. Since losing his original family, the completion of his life's work had provided no satisfaction, but had also freed him from compulsive pursuit of goals that had prevented him from engaging honestly with the relationships and responsibilities that remained available. To him, the silence that followed Rick Prime's final breath was not the peaceful quiet of resolution, but the hollow absence of purpose that accompanies the completion of goals that have consumed entire lifetimes in their pursuit. Rick Sanchez sat beside the corpse of his greatest enemy in a dimension that felt no different from any other, despite being the location where his decades-long quest had finally reached its conclusion, and the emptiness that flooded through him was so complete and devastating that it made his original grief over Diane and Beth seem like a manageable emotional experience by comparison. And so we conclude our journey through the infinite tragedy of Rick Sanchez, a man whose brilliant mind became both his greatest gift and his ultimate curse. From humble inventor to multiversal god, from loving father to revenge-obsessed killer, Rick's story reminds us that intelligence without wisdom, power without purpose, and infinite possibilities without meaningful connections lead only to the deepest forms of emptiness that no amount of technological achievement can fill. Perhaps Rick's true tragedy is not the loss of his original family, but his inability to find peace in the family that chose to love him, despite everything he had become. The replacement relationships he built through deception proved more genuine than the cosmic significance he sought through violence, yet he remained incapable of accepting love that was freely given rather than earned through superior capability and protective service. As you drift towards sleep, consider that even in infinite realities, even with unlimited power, the simple human connections we forge each day remain the only things that truly matter across all possible dimensions. Rick learned too late that replacing people is possible, but replacing love never works, and that the greatest scientific mind in the multiverse was ultimately defeated, not by a superior enemy, but by his own inability to value what he already possessed. Rest now, knowing that, unlike Rick, you exist in just one reality where every choice carries weight, every relationship has meaning, and every moment of peace is precious precisely because it cannot be infinitely replicated across countless dimensions. Sweet dreams in this singular, beautiful, irreplaceable dimension we call home.